HR Technical Working Group and Executive Director for Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and other members of the Technical Working Group. Also wish to recognize our partners for the webinar, namely the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, the University of Johannesburg, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, University of South Africa, UNISA, and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA, our distinguished resource persons, namely Ms. Sanusha Naidu, Parliamentary Diplomacy Coordinator, Institute for Global Dialogue, who is going to be moderating our webinar. Also wish to recognize our main presenter, Professor Spamandla Zondi, Director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, University of Johannesburg. Our first intervener, Dr. Dishare Rabele, an independent elections expert. And our second intervener, Ras Advocate Sipho Mantula from the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. I also wish to recognize representatives from the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, led by Dr. Victor Shale, as well as other election management bodies from the region under the auspices of the ECF Sadc. I wish to recognize civil society and media representatives, citizens joining us from across the region and in the diaspora, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Shaunen Kurasha. I'm the Program Manager for Democracy, Governance and Human Rights at the Sadc Parliamentary Forum. I'm distinctly honored to be the Director of Ceremonies for the first part of the webinar before I hand over to my colleague, Sanusha, who is going to moderate the session. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural Sadc Parliamentary Forum Regional Webinar Series on Democratic Governance in the Sadc region. This is a platform for parliamentarians and stakeholders to engage as they examine, discuss, and engage exchange experiences on various regional issues of interest and concern from a parliamentary perspective. The timing of this webinar couldn't have been more appropriate when one considers that we're in the year 2024. The year has been dubbed the super election year because of the number of electoral activities that are taking place, not just in the region, not just on the continent, but even globally, with nearly half of the world's population going for polls this year in 64 countries. On the continent, we have 17 countries that have elections, and that entails over 180 million eligible voters that will participate. In the Sadc region, we have 7 countries that have elections. Comoros, which held elections in January, South Africa and Madagascar, which had their elections on the same day, 29 May 2024. Then Botswana, Mozambique, Mauritius, and Namibia also have elections scheduled for this year. The webinar series is also being launched at a time when Sadc PF's transformation is gathering momentum. I'm sure it's a matter that the Madam SG may address now or during the question and answer session, with 11 of the 12 requisite member states having already ratified the agreement amending the Sadc Treaty on the establishment of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum following a decision of the summit to transform Sadc PF. We also are launching this webinar series at a time when we are witnessing the rise of coalition governance in a multipolar context. And this obviously brings complex challenges and opportunities in terms of the flexibility, the adaptability, and that is required to accommodate the diverse interests and viewpoints. And the primary challenge is always the achievement of consensus amongst the actors who hold different world viewpoints. We also are launching the webinar when we are witnessing entrenched geopolitics globally, and the Sadc region is not spared, including the competition for natural resources, in particular the transitional minerals, which the Sadc region obviously hold in abundance. We also seeing REX having to navigate these complex pressures with a view to protect their interests, but also to address the traditional challenges, including unemployment, inequality, and poverty. We also have a context where the African election authorities have adopted the principles and guidelines for the use of digital and social media in elections in Africa. We know that social media has become a big factor in terms of not just elections, but democracy itself. And it's an honor that the IEC South Africa is in the meeting, because they led the process of the development of these principles, and it would be interesting to hear their experiences, because the launch happened this year. That means the elections in South Africa and Madagascar will be amongst the first elections to happen when these principles and guidelines were adopted. In summary, the regional webinar series has 4 pillars. The first pillar is knowledge sharing and capacity building. The second pillar is promotion of best practices. The third pillar is fostering dialogue and exchange, particularly riding on and leveraging on the convening power of Parliament, and also the fact that Parliament is an infrastructure of peace. And the fourth pillar is policy advocacy and recommendation. In the end, it is the value of the webinar series will come from its ability to generate policy recommendations and advocate strategies for strengthening of democratic institutions and promoting the values that must characterize democracy across the Sadc region. Turning to the inaugural webinar, where we're focusing on key issues and lessons from the 2024 South Africa general elections and compliance with the Sadc model law. We all are aware of the context of the South African elections, in particular the outcome where, for the first time since the end of apartheid, ANC has failed to secure an outright majority, resulting in a hung parliament. And obviously this outcome then necessitates coalition building to form government. And these are some of the issues that are going to be focused on as we embark on the first webinar under the series. Specific to the to the webinar today, we have we have 4 objectives, namely to facilitate in-depth engagement among electoral stakeholders in the Sadc region on the 2024 South Africa elections as a case study, to understand the practical application of the Sadc model law on elections, drawing lessons to promote best practices and encourage compliance with Sadc principles and guidelines governing democratic elections across the region, share lessons and best practices that can be applied in future electoral processes and democratic governance in Southern Africa and across member states, with the aim of strengthening electoral integrity, fostering political stability, and supporting overall democratic development within the region. Enhance participants' understanding of the Sadc model law on elections and its practical application with a view to encouraging compliance with democratic norms and standards by highlighting the importance of implementing electoral reforms, including prioritizing the domestication of the model law. And lastly, provide a platform for discussing the dynamics of coalition governments, including the frameworks governing coalition governments, and drawing lessons from regional and international experiences to make policy recommendations for the Sadc region. Madam Secretary General and our distinguished participants, without any further ado, we must now move to the official opening session, where I have the honor of inviting Madam Secretary General Boemo Sekoma to give welcome remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies. Are you able to hear me?
Clearly, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much and good morning to you all. Allow me to recognize Honorable Leonard Mwalanda, the chairperson of the Democratization, Governance and Human Rights Regional Standing Committee of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum and members of this committee, Dr. Anna Moyo, the chairperson of the DGHR Technical Working Group, and also the executive director, Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and members of the Technical Working Group, our partners, the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, University of Johannesburg, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, University of South Africa, and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA. Our distinguished resource persons, Ms. Sanusha Naidu, Parliamentary Diplomacy Coordinator, Institute for Global Dialogue, who is the moderator of this webinar, main presenter, Professor Siphamandla Zondi, Director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, University of Johannesburg, the first inventor, Dr. Litlari Rabele, I hope it's not Litlari, because it's so too sometimes, yes. Rabele, the independent elections expert, and second intervener, Ras Advocate Sipho Mantula, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, the University of South Africa, representatives from IEC South Africa, Dr. Victor Shale, our all-weather friend, and other electoral management bodies from across the region under the banner of ECF Sadc, civil society and media representatives, including the South Africa Parliament media representative who are also assisting us to stream this activity for the benefit of South African citizens and parliamentarians, Sadc citizens joining us from the region and the diaspora, the young people of this region, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted and honored to welcome you to this important webinar, which is just the beginning of a series that will be looking at democratic governance in the Sadc region, with a specific lens today on the 2024 election outcome of South Africa general elections. And particularly, we are trying to look at the elements that could assist us domesticate the Sadc model law on elections. As I was preparing for this meeting, I was reminded of what the UN Secretary General of the UN at that time, Kofi Annan, said when he made closing remarks at the Ministerial Warsaw in Poland in June 2000. He challenged us to promote Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to enable people to freely learn from each other and find common solutions to challenges facing them. I believe this series is one such that will heighten this sensitivity and articulation of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I fully associate with that view, and I'm delighted to be part of this community of intellectuals, of citizens, of young people, of parliamentary practitioners, of media personnel who are committed to continually water our democracy. We meet today, colleagues, to share lessons shared from previous elections, including this one of South Africa, which should serve as a cornerstone to democratic processes in our region. We are also committed to explore the pivotal role that parliaments play in upholding the integrity of elections. In any democracy, if democracy is betrayed, it is the institution of parliament that will suffer. If inclusivity and democracy are betrayed, it is parliament who will bear the brunt. If the constitutional rule of law is betrayed, it is parliament who will ultimately suffer. If democracy delivers those who are not democratically elected, it is the citizens and parliament that will ultimately suffer. I'm happy that we will meet today to indeed, among other things, attempt to explore avenues of how we can uphold the integrity of elections and safeguard our democracy with all that we have, if anything through discussion, if anything through our intellect and analysis. Allow me to digress a little bit here and share what is happening to our sister regional economic community, ECOWAS, who are currently facing major geopolitical concerns. The ECOWAS region at the moment is in danger of disintegration, with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso threatening withdrawal. There are also the challenges of cross-border terrorism and insurgencies, especially with 4 member states, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea being under military rule. This recent wave of military coup has also instilled fear across member states, especially with the volatility of the Sahel region and external influences from foreign bodies. We also woke up recently to what happened in the DRC, and I believe such should be condemned with all that we have, at least through speech where possible. Economically, while the region has managed to remove some of the barriers of trade, there still remains a number of impediments that are hindering economic integration across the region. This brings me to why I'm so delighted that we're meeting, because often, and allow me to quote Professor Gemick's words, that we have to recognize that democracy is not granted to us once and for all. We need to nurture its foundations. We need to continually reinforce. We need to continually reinforce through efforts such as this one's, cooperation, dialogue, among others. It is for this reason that I cite what is happening in the ECOWAS, because there is stability somewhat. There are processes which are democratic that are happening in that region, but it does not remove concerns around political disorder. And I hope that we will be able to have conversations around what is happening in our region, mindful of what is happening elsewhere. And we can always take time to do so through such webinars. Let me come to what is happening and why we're meeting here today, which is the valuable lessons that we're going to glean from what is happening in South Africa today. There's a lot that we can speak of. There's a lot of similarities that we can draw from what is happening currently elsewhere and what has happened in the past in the Sadc region. We must be able to reflect on the challenges that we faced. We must be able to highlight the successes and also look at the overall democratic health of our electoral processes. We must be able to look at how we can strengthen future electoral processes across the region, of course, using the Sadc model law in elections as a benchmark. Certainly, as we look at the SADC model law on elections, let's look at what does it mean to ensure transparency? What does it mean that an election process should be fair and credible? We must be able to cultivate an environment where truly our member states can domesticate this model law, leading to enhanced political stability and socioeconomic developments. I wouldn't want to go further into the substance of the process today. Safe to say, I'm very happy to have you as valuable partners of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. I'm very happy that you are bringing to our attention what it means to deal with a hung parliament or hung elections. What does it mean that we're all of a sudden going to be dealing with coalition governments? How do we promote regional stability and uphold parliamentary supremacy? And the model law on elections that the SADC PF has elected gives us a framework to be able to deliberate on some of these concerns. It is for this reason that I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you, that I'm excited that we have a wealth of knowledge that we are going to share with the region and beyond. I would like to stop here, colleagues, and say, allow me to learn. If I have anything to say at the end of the day, I'll be able to say that in our closing remarks. Thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies. I encourage you to share abundantly your ideas, whether from the left or the right or the center, whether it is constitutionalism in relation to elections and democracy. Let's share those perspectives as we foster a culture of inclusive democracy and governance. I look forward to hearing from you and meeting you yet again at the end of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam SG, for the welcome remarks. Indeed, this is a learning opportunity. It's a place of exchange of ideas, and she calls on all of us, whatever our conviction, to make use of this space to be able to share our views as we seek to strengthen, to build the democracy that we want in the SADC region. At this juncture, I have the honor of inviting the chairperson of the Technical Working Group, which has been the brains behind the organization of this webinar, Dr. Anna Moyo. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Kurasha. I must say my doctorate is still in hibernation, to be continued. But thank you for the honor. It shows it's still coming and on the way. I would also like to stand on protocols already observed and also acknowledge specifically our esteemed guests and participants in our webinar today. As we start, I would like to acknowledge and honor Her Excellency, Madam Sehoma, the SADC Parliamentary Forum Secretary General. I also honor Honorable Leonard Mwalanda, Chairperson of the Democratization, Governance and Human Rights Standing Committee and members of the committee. I recognize our partners, the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Thabo Mbeki African School of Public International Affairs at the University of South Africa, and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA. I acknowledge and honor our distinguished resource persons, Ms. Sanusha Naidu, Parliamentary Diplomacy Coordinator, Institute for Global Dialogue, who is the moderator of this webinar.
Just a moment, Dr. Moyo. ICT assist, I think there is interference with interpretation. Sounds like Portuguese.
And the message I want you to take is that Africa pay back.
Ronald?
Kindly continue. It should be okay now.
Okay, Dr. Moyo. Take the floor.
Thank you. I would like to also honor our distinguished resource persons, Ms. Sanusha Naidu, who's the Parliamentary Diplomacy Coordinator at the Institute for Global Dialogue, who's also the moderator of this webinar. Our main presenter, Prof. Siphamandla Zondi, who is also the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Our first intervener, Dr. Declare Rabele, who's the independent elections expert, and second intervener, Ras Advocate Sipho Mantula, who is at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. I also honor representatives from the IEC South Africa, Dr. Victor Shale and other EMPs from across the region under the banner of ECF Sadc. I also honor and acknowledge civil society and media representatives who are present, the Sadc citizens joining us from the region and the diaspora, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. As Dr. Kurashe has already highlighted in his opening remarks, this is a watershed year for elections globally, but also for the continent and for the Sadc region specifically. With the 7 elections that he spoke about that are taking place in the region this year, this represents an opportunity for us to reflect on some of the trends that we are seeing. Coalition governments, for instance, governments of national unity, and what citizens want as expressed through democratic processes such as voting, as we have seen South Africa, for instance, a country that has recently emerged from its own elections. Africa voted this year, specifically 30 years after celebrated adult suffrage of the majority of its citizens who had been denied the previously. We are also seeing former liberation struggle movements and political parties, their grip on the electorate, this signaling the waning of the support of the very populace that celebrated their coming to power as part of transitioning from colonial rule to a more inclusive and democratic rule. As Her Excellency Madam Sehoma has highlighted, reflections also serve to review how aligned our elections in the Sadc region are to some of the instruments that have been developed and are being implemented in the region. Sadc Parliamentary Forum has taken the lead in developing some of the instruments that really would help us to ensure that our democratic processes and our elections are free, fair, and also just, ensuring citizens at the center. The role of, particularly in elections, and monitor elections and conducted in ways actually feed to democratic processes and uphold some of these processes on the continent and in the region cannot be underestimated. As we have seen with the Sadc Parliamentary Forum taking the lead in developing the model law on elections, for instance, this is actually a lesson that can actually be used, and also some of the instruments that can also inform other regional mechanisms that we have in place. And again, taking this lead in ensuring that we monitor and reflect on some of these processes. As the Technical Working Group on Democratization, Human and out of this moment, whereby we are beginning to reflect on some of these processes, and again, ensuring again that we continuously reflect on how some of these instruments that have been developed in the Sadc region are being implemented, even as we continue to uphold democratic processes and good governance in the region. Really purpose where we are reflecting on some of these trends that we are seeing, but also very much ensuring that citizens are at the center of some of these processes, and that what citizens want and what citizens have expressed through democratic processes such as voting during elections are upheld, even as we ponder on ways forward, moving forward, particularly where a majority that will see specifically a specific party leading the country over governance of a country have not been attained, such as we have seen in the South African election. But we have lessons also from other countries in the Southern Africa region, where governments of national unity, coalitions have also been put in place as some of the solutions towards ensuring that we ensure that the peace that we have sustained, the peace that we have secured, for instance, from colonial era violations, as well as the brutalization and marginalization of Black majority people, is sustained beyond the current elections and beyond our time. We have lessons also drawn from other jurisdictions, for instance, from the global stage. Countries like Switzerland, Belgium, for instance, have had government of national unity. And we have lessons that we can learn and draw from some of their experiences. But today also serves us to reflect on what does this mean, particularly for some of the instruments that we have put in place, and how aligned are our elections, and how can we improve some of our elections, particularly in alignment with some of the instruments that have been put in place. I invite us all as we join our main speakers, our moderator, and our panelists today to really reflect and engage in robust discussions around particularly governance and democracy in Southern Africa. And what does this mean, particularly for some of these instruments? What are some of the gaps that still persist? And what are some of the solutions that can lead us forward toward a more peaceful, inclusive governance and democracy in South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo, for that very insightful address. The holding of this webinar is testimony in terms of the importance of collaboration between government, state institutions, and civil society organizations. And the technical working group has been leading on that front in terms of taking a full advantage of the opportunities for collaboration to put up an initiative such as the regional webinar series. And we are thankful to Dr. Moyo for their leadership of the technical working group. I wish to highlight particularly the question that you raise to say, what does this mean for the instrument that we have put in place, and how aligned are they with the current trends and challenges vis-a-vis the context of the political developments we have seen in the region? I think one of the things that we need to really look at is how relevant are the instruments that are already in existence, and what do we need to strengthen the frameworks, to strengthen the practices, as you said, to make sure that we sustain the peace, and more importantly, we entrench the culture of human rights, respect for human rights, and not repeat the cycle of gross violations, which we saw yesteryear in the colonial and apartheid era. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo, for the address. At this juncture, we move towards the next session, the next part of the webinar, where I am honored to present our distinguished panelists made up of eminent persons who are going to lead us as we discuss on the topic, key issues and lessons from the 2024 South Africa general elections and compliance with the Sadc model law on elections. Our panelists, who are renowned leaders and experts in the fields of governance, electoral processes, and regional policy, bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this important conversation. I'm sure their insights will help us to understand the complexities of the recent South Africa elections and assess issues related to the model law vis-a-vis the broader context that has been highlighted. Allow me, therefore, to introduce our panelists, beginning with the moderator, Ms. Sanusha Naidu. She's a foreign policy analyst. Currently, she's a senior research associate based at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Her research interests include democratization in Africa, Africa's political economy and development, Africa's relations with emerging powers from the South, South Africa foreign policy analysis, the role of Track 2 diplomacy in international relations. Ms. Naidu holds a master's in international relations from the University of Staffordshire, United Kingdom. She previously worked at the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town and managed the South Africa Foreign Policy Initiatives at the Open Society Foundations for South Africa. In the past several years, she has also managed programs that focused on Africa's international relations with China and emerging powers based at the farm from 2008 to 2010. She has extensive publications. She's also a regular media commentator on national and international issues for major news agencies. She's also a regular analyst on South Africa's domestic politics and electoral trends. The second panelist is our main presenter, Professor Zondi. Pamandla Zondi is the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, where he teaches research methods for political research and analysis. His recently published book is NGOs, Africa and the World. We have an intervener, the first intervener, Dr. Dihare Rabele, who is a gender and governance expert with focus on women in elections and peace-building processes. She has more than 20 years experience in elections, in election observation, having worked with NDI and the Carter Center, AISA, and the AU, and having observed various elections on the continent. She was recently involved with AISA during the South Africa 2024 national and provincial elections, providing analysis of the elections. The expertise is in the participation of women in elections and peace processes. She has experience working on advancement of women in peace mediation and mediation processes, having studied and conducted a PhD research on women's inclusion in mediation in South Sudan. Last but by no means least, RAS advocate Sipho Mandula is an intellectual, as he elegantly loves to call himself. He's an intellectual laborer with UNISA. He's a Pan-African human rights defender, an analyst, and an election observer. We definitely have an impeccable panel that should help us to engage in a stimulating and informative way. And we look forward to a very engaging session. At this juncture, I have the honor of inviting our moderator, Sanush, to take over the floor. Over to you, Sanush.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of ceremonies. I'm really honored and privileged to be invited to moderate a very, very timely and, of course, pivotal discussion on the SADC electoral law, as well as the kinds of discussions that would see member states domesticating it. Firstly, let me also observe all protocol and send my greetings to everyone that has been mentioned, from the SADC Parliamentary Secretary to the members of the Parliamentary Forum, to other honorable members that are online as well as part of the discussion, and of course to all guests that are basically attending, including the institutes that are partners to this discussion today. Firstly, let me not become that moderator that says takes on a lot of the space and the time and trying to provide a kind of lecture of her own here. But let me just say a few opening remarks, and then I want to invite Professor Zondi to make the presentation for the discussion today. I think for us in South Africa, it has been a very pivotal moment in our democratic history in terms of where we find ourselves, democratically, electorally, but also in terms of the reconfiguration of some of our political dynamics, particularly in terms of where we are as well in the context of a viable opposition and the opposition dynamics that we see. I think the election in itself has really raised a number of key points that we need to consider in terms of how do we ventilate this in the context of where we are electorally in terms of our parliament. The fact of the matter is that there is no a single dominant party that actually has dominant control of the parliament, as previously we have seen. And more importantly, I think in the run-up to this election, it's been very interesting in viewing and also assessing the kinds of discussions that were taking place, particularly in terms of our management of our electoral law and the amendment of electoral law, particularly the interpretation of how do we include independent candidates within our electoral landscape, as candidates can be contesting an election in the context of the regional elections and the provincial elections. And I think the complexities of our electoral system as well has raised a number of pivotal issues that we need to discuss and take forward. And so what is fascinating about the current landscape where we find ourselves in waiting for a government of national unity to be announced, we do know that it is not necessarily only about the announcement of the government of national unity, but it's also watching very clearly and cohesively the fact that Parliament has been a very pivotal actor and strategic actor in this election. For many analysts, including myself, I think we were watching really what was going to happen in the contextualization as well as the composition of Parliament in terms of the seat allocations in the National Assembly, which has 400 seats, of which 200 is reserved for the national elections, only for political parties to contest, and then of course 200 which included both parties as well as independent candidates. I think there are a few very important signal signs that have come out of this election for us in South Africa around our electoral system, our PR system, and the way that works in the proportional representation of parties, the number of parties that have contested in the elections, and the number of parties that actually been able to win seats based on the formula that we use. So there are a number of technical issues, but also thematic and substantive issues that raise fascinating debates and questions around how do we move forward in terms of our electoral dynamics and the relationship between the citizen and the context of our electoral democracy and the social contract within that. So I think there's a number of questions that I would definitely see us having a discussion and hopefully we'll be able to ventilate them as we move forward. But having said that, I'd like to invite Professor Zondi to make his presentation. And I'm sure that we're going to find some fascinating insights based on some of the key questions that have been provided in terms of the guiding questions for this webinar today around how do we interpret the electoral processes, both before the election and post the election, and where we currently find ourselves, the dynamics of best practice. What does this mean for the type of coalition governance we're observing? What does it mean when we talk about a government of national unity and the dynamics of how that is constituted? What are some of the challenges and opportunities around electoral management as we speak? There are challenges that the Independent Electoral Commission is facing with regard to a court case that is they are currently engaged in on the election results and challenges around that, and the reforms and compliance, which I mentioned, but how do we see that going forward, particularly as we look at the forthcoming 2026 local government election, and the factors, particularly factors around what are the push and pull factors and the drivers that kind of underpin this election, and how did the mandate come about from the voters in terms of deciding that no single party will get a majority, and the recommendations around the observations, etc., by both the region as well as international observers in looking at this election and some of the key issues that came out, both in terms of the electoral management, the education question around civic participation, understanding the dynamics of this election in terms of the three ballots we had, and how that may have played a critical role as well in the context of the elections and the context of it being free, fair, and just. So let me invite Prof. Zondi to take the platform and provide us with his presentation.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much to the Master of Ceremonies. Thank you I just want to greet the honorables that spoke before me. I know that we are a bit behind our program, so allow me to simply just go straight to my presentation. If the IT and the host could allow me to share my presentation so that it is easier for us to move. I want to preface my presentation with this statement. Almost every election now in this region and on the continent generally has become a referendum on democracy, the extent to which democracy is deepening or the democracy is not deepening. Can the host enable me to share? Yeah, and it is a referendum on whether we can deepen democracy or not deepen democracy. Secondly, that the referendum is also related to that. This referendum is also a referendum about whether our citizens are maturing to become fully sovereign citizens that are able to take decisions that can change society and sometimes cause dramatic change in the parliamentary system. I still do not have ability to, please someone make me a host,
especially to
a co-host, so that I can share my presentation.
We are begging financially.
Simple. Just make me a host. Very simple.
And therefore, we are able to use public finance.
Kindly try again.
Into, as it were, fund all our.
Thank you. I now have it. Sorry. Thank you so much. So I wanted to say that it is therefore a sort of a referendum on citizens and on parties and all of them. Let me also say that the South African election was marking the 30 years of post-apartheid, which is sometimes called freedom, sometimes called democracy. The two do not mean the same thing, but we use those words quite interchangeably. There was always quite an expectation that South Africa would lead by an example, and that as we moved to this election, knowing that this election was most likely going to lead to a hung parliament, it was expected that South Africa will kind of set an example for other countries in the region and on the continent on how coalitions are going to work on the African continent. So there was a lot of expectation taking place. And the elections, these elections, unlike the previous elections, took place under conditions where the governing party was pretty stable on the inside, not divided as it has been in previous elections, but where there's been intense competition between the governing party and other parties. Thirdly, there had been developed a very united position among parties other than the governing ANC party about that seek to suggest that the problem is the ANC and that they all going to join together to bring it down so that it does not have power, at least bring it down below 50%. So there was that very concerted effort. There seemed to have been a concerted effort also by the funders generally, those who fund political parties in line with the Political Party Funding Act, to also achieve the same purpose, that there should be any dominant party anymore in South Africa, but there should be a form of coalition that will take it. And that's an important context. Let me just then proceed to say, how did it all work? The part of the significance of this election is the participation. The 300 parties that were likely to participate in the end, we had 70 parties that participate. That includes small parties, many small parties, and a lot of well-known parties. So there's huge participation, huge choice for voters. The second one is that the election took place under conditions where there had been consolidation in the political atmosphere, almost dividing South Africa into two sectors, political system. One is the center right, led by the Democratic Alliance, but with a number of parties that fall within that line. And when we're doing an analysis, there were about close to 35 of those parties that could belong to the center right. And center right in this case means that in the center they are moderate, but they tilt to the right on economic policy, on some political rights, on constitutional issues, and so on. And then we have the center left, which is led by the ANC, which is the lead in the center left, and a whole slew of parties that kind of mirror its positions and also significant in number, almost about 40 of them belong into that thing. And pretty much nothing in between, simply because for a long time, South Africa's political alignment has been shifting to the center. For the past 4 elections, it's been the center that has dominated our politics, beyond an opposition or on the governing party side. So that consolidation marked the conditions under which this election took place, and that favored conditions for a government, coalition government, because there's very little real fundamental differences among parties on the right of the center or on the left of the center, and sometimes between them across the aisle. Makes it a lot easier, policy agenda and all that, for them to put together. We needed to not have what we could call extreme left, and pretty much we also no longer have extreme right political parties in South Africa. You have moderate parties. That is, if you isolate a policy agenda from rhetoric. So we don't have, in terms of policy agenda, parties that are on the end of the extremes. Every party is in the moderate phase. Another part of the context is declines and rises. The ANC has been declining at the rate of about 3 to 5% almost every election now for quite a long time. And if it continued to decline at the level it was declining, it would have got 52%, 51% now. But this time it declined more significantly than before because it declined by 17%. The EFF also has started to reach a ceiling, and that could point it to a slight decline, but it has been kind of maintaining if we look at the last 3 elections. And there's been also a decline of unionization, a decline of mobilization of social forces that are progressive, that are for change. So union power has been diminishing for a time, partly because it's been dividing, but also because the main trade union movements have been also weakening. We have already long seen that the broader civil society mobilization has also been on a decline and compensated by the strong rise and maintenance of elite and litigious civil society formations, which is those that use the law, like freedom under law, and a few others. But mass-based civil society has been diminishing in power because the institutions that they've depended on have been weakening. And those that have maintained, such as the Homeless People's Movement, Abasa Albasem Jondo and others, have sought to grow under very difficult conditions and all of that. In that same context, there have been rises that we can see even ahead of this election. Rise of smaller parties has been growing in a significant way. Buoyed by experiences they've been getting at local government level and been able to win quite a lot, to use power, checkmate other parties in a significant way. There have been a great rise of smaller parties. But in the run-up to election, there have been more rise of smaller parties on the center right than on the center left. That signals something that right is growing in terms of the number of parties along that line. We had the Busa party, we had the Rise of Zanzi, we had Hope for South Africa that did quite well, and a few others that could be classified along those lines. So there's something happening there. But there's been also almost rejuvenation of critical social movements, not to the extent one would expect, but it is important. Party funding dynamics after the modification of the act, we're seeing consolidation as well. And the rise of small parties is linked to the party funding dynamics. There's a very few actual big funders of political parties. A few of them fund parties across the aisle. But quite a number of these small parties on the center right were funded by the same funders as the funders of the big center right party, which is the DA, which means the capital and business and market is almost seeking to condition South Africa's choices towards the center right. But we'll have to watch that very carefully. The rise of the another faction of the ANC outside the ANC is an interesting story to tell. In 1997, 1998, the ANC had its first faction that led to a first breakaway party called the United Democratic Movement. It borrowed from the ANC and everything, regalia and talk and stuff, and it continues to exist to this point. And then again, significantly, in 2008, 2009, there was a birth of another one called Congress of the People, COPE Party, again mirroring the ANC, existing as an ANC faction outside the ANC. Again in 2014, with EFF, another ANC faction born on it. It is now repeated again. This time, we have what is called Umkhonto weSizwe Party, or MKP, led by the former president of the ANC, which has also been born as a faction of the ANC, but outside the ANC. So the ANC has given us a number of parties born out of it that extend from it and extend from its policies and keep its ideas alive outside the ANC. Though the ANC sees this as a loss or stuff, but actually ANC is morphing into other forms and maintaining its life through some form of reincarnation outside itself. And this is coming out of the ANC's being broad church, and some element of this broad church, some churches within this church are coming out to express the same thing. So the extension of the ANC brand. The ANC has been unable to fight these. Each one of them has not been able to fight it on the basis of intellectual property rights, or on the basis of copying from it, and the basis of anything. It's unable to do that. And so these parties are able to harness the iconography of the ANC, eat into its base, and then add something else to build up. And all of these parties are significant. Perhaps the UDM was less significant in 1997 because it got votes that were less than 1 million, but the parties after that got 1 million and above. And the MK MK party is the most significant of them because it has got double what other parties had got in the past. Completely huge, over 2 million. That's a huge win for it. Zuma is a big factor in this because Zuma alone was able to bring numbers to the ANC, is therefore able to take numbers from the ANC as a factor. His ability to mobilize is very entrenched in society, and has been around for a long time. He's a father figure, but he's also a smart and cunning politician, able to do that. But more than that, it is also that the parties, all of these parties, including the MKP, they all piggyback on the ANC's widespread structures on the web. They piggyback on it before they create their own structures. They use the ANC structures. So they cannibalize the ANC. They parasite on the ANC and gain a lot. And that's what they have done right now. The context was also the decline in the budget for the Independent Electoral Commission. And that put certain limitations on the commission and can explain some of the weaknesses that we witnessed as observers. We witnessed, for example, that it seems that not sufficient training has been given to electoral officers, judging by how they were managing small dynamics like queue management, like communication to people, like managing small legal conflict or stuff of that nature. And they tended to be a little younger normally, and they tended to be female. And we went to some stations where very complicated one in township where it will be 12 females and 1 male, and they have to deal with these drunk men or macho men, and poor women would not be able to manage those. So there was an impact of the budget on the quality of the electoral management system, including the quality of voter education that needed to happen before. We only had 2 sessions of voter education, 2 weekends. Even that was quite limited. And yet this was going to be a complicated election with 3 ballots. Yeah, we could see that not enough had been spent, not enough energy had been put into educating the public and into training the staff. Perhaps not enough had been done also into doing dry run on the mechanisms that are now being used, on how to resolve situations such as when people are not in the electronic voters roll, have to be checked manually. Sometimes staff did not know how to do that and stuff like that. So you could see that there was an impact of the budget that has to do with austerity that the South African government has imposed. Then there was also a pre-election pact, and was only one pre-election pact in South Africa, unfortunately, and that was one called the Moonshot Pact, which became known as Multi-Party Charter, which was made up of the parties on the center right, and that they are also in the opposition, led by the DA. This sought to bring the ANC down, government, but also to pursue more liberal policies across the range of policy sectors. And this pact helped these parties to work together to prepare themselves for the election. But it was hoped that this would be the basis for building a coalition thereafter. We'll come to that a little later on. And there was a huge experiment with this, and that worked. Another experiment held was a national dialogue convened by the deputy president on coalition government. It was a huge, a very well-attended 2-day national dialogue. It was able to identify some of the important principles. One of the principles was the principle of threshold, that coalition governments are better led by parties that are leading in elections, even though they did not win the election. But the bigger the party, the more responsible for it to constitute the coalition, to lead the process of bringing it with. And then you see that happening now. The second one was that you should have a threshold for how small a party should be in order to join, to avoid a situation where those -1% parties are able to scuttle the whole thing and undermine consensus and all that, you will see that that idea was defeated. It was pretty much pushed by the DA, but it was defeated in the dialogue. It looks like it's not even applying even now. But that national dialogue was a useful experiment in getting the parties to talk to each other long before they have to negotiate with each other. And I think that created conditions for parties to learn to engage. And that was an important innovation. It was a smooth campaigning period from what I could work with. We could tell, of course, I was working there with an NGO called Devoted Citizens NGO Movement that was dedicated to mobilizing the citizens to take keen interest in the entire process from campaigning all the way to the end to observation. We noticed that there was quite a smooth campaigning, and the campaigning was mostly focused on advertising via social media. That was one measure, a form of advertising, because many parties could not afford anything beyond that. But they also realized that social media campaigns are actually very good campaigning. Some parties were able to use bots, or what they call robots or fake accounts, in order to generate debates in certain areas. That way, gain some momentum. The second form of advertising has been through mass media, using radio and TV quite a lot. And that a lot of parties were able to do that. A few parties were able to do that, but it was quite expensive. It was mainly about 6 bigger parties that were able to do that. It was mainly the ANC, the DA. It was also the Action SA that we saw the Freedom Front would do the kind of marketing. And the third form of marketing was direct contact with people. There were 2 types of direct contact with people. One was what is called door-to-door, and that many parties were able to do that. At a national level, it should be the ANC that was most effective in doing that all over the place. The DA was able to do that. Action SA at a national level, Rise Mzansi, a very new young, but was able to be everywhere in the country because they had 30 million rands that was given to them ahead of elections by funders, the same funders as those who fund the DA and others, and all that. The second type of direct mobilization was rallies and big stadiums. The real big competitors there, it is the ANC and the MK party. Those are the one that really could do that. And then third would be the EFF and then the DA. Those are the parties that could do those big stadium meetings, put people, over 70, 80,000 people in a stadium for a campaign. The ANC, more than everybody, did several of those. It has the capacity to do that. It has a history of doing it, and all of that. That was quite useful. We did not see much use of AI, artificial intelligence, in this campaign polling. But what we did get to see was the use of polling. There were a lot of opinion polls, lots of them this time, a lot more than before. But there were about 5 major ones, and they all confirmed trends that we've come to see after elections. But some of these polls were actually used for campaigning purposes, because 2 of these polls were by institutes linked to the Democratic Alliance Party, the DA, and they were using it to manage public perception and very. This election has been pretty much peaceful. The pre-election, not major cases of intimidation and violence, very isolated and very manageable. None of them are consequential, even at voting district level. We saw very lively media engagement, which is now different from campaigning. That is where parties are invited to media town hall meetings, to debates, and the media was very good in ensuring that all parties are represented. And in morning panels, it would be about 8, 9 parties, major parties, and they will swap them around. And we had very interesting debates for parties that were very policy focused, where parties were hard pressed to demonstrate that they were capable of doing what they say they wanted to do. They had through not balloons, but we had through ballots. And that was a new innovation that we had this year with the introduction of what was called the regional ballot that enabled citizens to vote for their representative from their own provinces that must represent them in the national parliament. And secondly, to allow them to also vote for independent individuals who are running for elections. Very few of them will come to that. And then the provincial ballot is what we've always had, where we're electing a representative in provincial legislature across nine provinces. But because of this dynamic, we needed a lot of education for voters to understand what was happening. We found that not enough had been done. Of course, just 2 weekends of very superficial voter education could not have been enough. So the IEC then has some lessons to learn, but also the political parties and civil society formations that needed to do something, they are bit in this. As a result, we saw a lot of people who were confused in polling stations. We heard a lot of people who might have not reflected their will properly because they misunderstood the 3 ballots. 30 political parties in, and I could only count 4 independents. One from Western Cape, Sadc Ahmad, who's a very famous activist and AIDS activist and social justice activist, very prominent, the one who challenged President Beki the most over his positions on HIV/AIDS. He ran, but got very little votes. Though it's very popular, though was able to get a lot of signatures that were needed in order for to sign, up, but he did not get the votes, even equivalent to the signatures that he got. But that is the case also with many other parties that all needed to have 100,000 signatures, but failed to only get 2,000 votes. Then we wonder, who are these signatories? And all these people who simply say, I will sign for you to give you a chance, but we don't have confidence enough to vote you into power. The other 3 independent candidates came from one province, actually Limpopo, very interesting individuals. Smooth election day, but long queues. That led to many thinking that perhaps the turnout this time is longer. But it turns out that the long queues were long, partly because of the efficiencies on the part of the IEC. It is how efficiently they were managing the process at the IEC, because in the end, they actually found that the voter turnout had actually declined, though there were queues all over. So queues aren't always a marker of interest, but sometimes can be a judgment on the efficiency of the electoral management body. In a number of cases where we as observers would go and even advise, is that you would have a queue that you can look and say it's about 800 people, but they're all in one queue, when you can actually split the queue into 3 queues, get divided by ranges of surnames and stuff like that. That helped in many cases where that was introduced, then things started to move quickly. But there was a good turnout, obviously, not as much as it was expected, but there was a good. There were some issues with the voter management devices, especially in the early days, in the early part of the day, but they then picked up and could work. In some cases, it was just the electoral officers not testing things in the morning, early morning, before people turn out. But in the end, it all worked very well. These voter management devices have been very, very helpful in terms of generating data and protecting the process. 17% decline in the ANC power, it's massive. In many cases, it's called a catastrophe. It should lead to a resignation of a government or the president or staff. This time it did not, and it was a catastrophic result for the ANC. And the ANC then lost 3 provinces outright, which was the Northern Cape. It lost just by a small percentage, and it was Gauteng, and then it was KwaZulu-Natal. And that is huge because it meant the ANC is now out of the big economic centers of South Africa. That's what it was meant. It was going to mean, which is why it had to respond the way it had to respond in the coalitions. We had the exit of small parties that have been around for a while, including ZAPO and National Freedom Front and others. National Freedom Party and others, and all that. And there was the entry of 4 small parties that was significant, especially the entry of, not 4 actually, but more, the entry of Action SA, the entry of BUSA, the entry of Rise Mzansi, would be quite remarkable. And so for the system is renewing itself. The exit is the exit of center-left parties. The entry is the entry of center-right parties. I'm sure you will be able to notice what is happening here. A remarkable rise, of course, by the ANC breakaway. We've spoken to that. It became number 1 in one province in KwaZulu-Natal. It became number 2 in Mpumalanga province, and it was top 5 in the other provinces. And that's quite remarkable for a party that was 5 months old. The MKP, in terms of the post-election, the MKP plus 20 other parties disputed the election results and challenged it with the IEC. The IEC cleared the election results, but then they took it to court, and the court has also rejected appeal, the challenge, but then now appealed further to the Constitutional Court. The challenge is on the basis that they feel that there was undercounting. They feel that there was an exclusion of people because of inefficiencies in the system. And they also are critical of one of the commissioners in the IEC, and that's Commissioner Janet Love, that they feel that is too close to the governing party, the ANC, and that she might have influenced things. Of course, they have to adduce evidence to that, and it's going to be very difficult to prove it. But the aim was not to prove anything, but the aim was to signal, to challenge, and to signal their presence in the political system, and to put the IEC in a tight corner and make it a little careful about everything going forward. And they're preparing for 2026 local government elections. They're prepping all our minds for 2026 local government elections. So besides that, every other party accepted the results as free and fair. Now the MK party did not attend the first sitting of the parliament. The 58 members of parliament did not attend that. Part of it is to signal, part of it is not to be in that process where they have to witness the election of President Ramaphosa, who they oppose very viciously. And they have now since been sworn in just yesterday. Then the results have produced for us hung parliament and hung legislatures in 3 provinces, sorry, not 2, in KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, and in Northern Cape. That has led to coalition negotiations. The coalition negotiations idea quickly crystallized to only one option, and that option is a grand coalition which the ANC and DA call GNU, which is Government of National Unity. The grand coalition and all of that, signed by the ANC and DA, the original what's called Statement of Intent, which is really a framework document, which is to describe how what will frame the discussions towards the formation of this government, and that is now become the single route. You either in it or outside it. That's why we've gone. The GNU agreement is very big on the vision of a united South Africa in line with the Constitution, peace and prosperous country, subject to rule of law, run according to democratic norms and governance, and it's also big on principles. Principle of justice, of inclusivity, and principles of consultation, and all of that, almost written like a constitution. And it's also big on procedures. And there's a lot in there, but 2 procedures I would like to highlight is the procedure regarding decision-making. How will decisions be made in this thing? Be made through consultation at every level on any major decisions regarding the making of the government, the management of the government. The second one relates to deadlock breaking mechanism. What are the mechanism when the parties do not agree? It is there where you have the principle of sufficient consensus and a principle of full consensus. We'll come back to that. So the framework agreement is signed by 3 parties initially. 2 parties are part of the Moonshot Pact before elections, the DA and the IFP. And the other party, which now leads this, is the ANC. So the ANC is outnumbered at the beginning of the agreement. The framework agreement would begin to register its success when it guides the election of a ANC president as the country president, the ANC NEC member as the Speaker of Parliament, the ANC NEC member as the chairperson of the second House of Parliament, what we call the NCOP, and then the deputies for the Speaker and for the chairperson of House to come from the DA. If you look at it, the elections would revolve around 273, 283. That's the votes that those who support the GNU would get, because it would just be them, but it would be plus others. Because if I were to give you the numbers, at the time, the members of the GNU and those who check their interest in GNU would give you 196 votes, but they would get a lot more than that because other parties decided they're fine with this candidate, other fine with this candidate without joining the GNU. So that's why we get very good results. It would, over time, be joined by 7 other parties, so that by 24 June, which is 2 days ago, it has now 7 parties, 10 parties that represent 70% of the national vote. So it is significant. It's very, very good for them. But look at the ideological makeup of this, because that tells us how it's going to manage itself, what might be challenges going forward. Yeah, what I discovered, center-right parties, clearly there, the DA, the IFP, and Freedom Front, plus who are members of the Moonshot, all 3 of them, plus the Rise Mzansi, which is descends close to that. Though Rise Mzansi may be a little closer to the center than the rest of the other parties, these are to the center line than the other parties, but broadly are in the same category. Then you have the center-right parties, led by the ANC, led by the ANC. We have the Pan-African Congress of Azania. We have Al-Jamaa. We have the PA, I forgot the PA, the Patriotic Alliance, and the Good Party. They're pretty much on the center left. Now, the critical principle for deadlock making breaking mechanism there is what's called sufficient consensus, which means been interpreted to mean in the agreement to mean if parties constituting 60% of the national vote agree on anything, they can go on with a decision, even if there are parties that do not agree or members of the government that do not agree. Now, if you look at it, it is designed to tie the ANC to the DA, because that 60% can only be achieved under current conditions by the ANC and the DA. If the ANC wants to avoid the DA, it can draw from 9.4 something percent of the rest of the other small parties and end up with, now since we now have the last party joining in, it's now 10.3% and end up with 50.3%. We are still very far from the 60% deadlock breaking mechanism, which means if the ANC disagrees with the DA, the only way to break that consensus is for the DA and the ANC to agree. It's locked into them. That's why some people call it an ANC-DA. coalition with others joining in. That is what will be a big test for the party, is whether the two parties will learn to coexist and learn to work together, because neither of them have been given a sufficient majority. With regards to the formation of the government of national unity, because we don't have it in the place, because we have not formed government yet after elections, this is now deadlocked by the two parties that have the power to break that. The DA is demanding 11 ministries across all clusters. When you say clusters, the economic cluster, the social cluster, security cluster, and so on and so on. And they're also asking for a deputy president or minister in the presidency position. Minister in the presidency is important in South Africa because right now that minister of presidency is responsible for monitoring and evaluating the performance of all other ministries. So they have all the intelligence about who is implementing and not implementing. But secondly, the minister in the presidency is also responsible for national, for intelligence. The intelligence is in there. So they want either of two. The deputy president is a leader of government business, the actual link between the executive and parliament. And the DA have put that. And the ANC is refusing. The ANC offer was 6 ministries and 7 deputy ministries. Seems to me that now that the parties that put the offers on the ground in concrete terms, they will move closer to somewhere in between that. It might actually be 8 ministries, or may actually be 8 or 9 ministries, somewhere there. That is where we expect the agreement to come to in the coming days or weeks, because there is no prescription about how long it should take for a government to be formed. It can take a year, it can take longer, because government continue to function without ministers, which is a great fortune. The fact that there are the director generals and senior public administrators who are able to keep things working. Right now, the director generals are acting as almost like ministers, and they get the work done. Then get there. So the administration is relatively insulated from the political thing. It can function without ministers for as long as it should take. It's just that the perception of people might actually cause problems if we don't appoint ministers. So I've also indicated about the deadlock. Another development, as I draw towards a close, that I need to point out is that there is in the opposition side, it is also crystallizing into cooperative opposition. With the DA having vacated opposition benches, now the MKP has now become the leader of opposition by virtue of their numbers. Then we have the Economic Freedom Fighters, and then we have the African Transformation Movement, which is a faith-based left organization. The three of them are part of what is called Progressive Caucus that was established, that emerged about 2 weeks ago. These are parties that are progressive in their nature, that are pro-transformation. They want to position themselves that way. That they want to come together. They were previously had other parties that have now since moved into the governing coalition, the GNU, and that is the Al Jama party, which is a Muslim party, and then the UDM, the former breakaway from the ANC, the 1997 one breakaway from the ANC. They've since moved from this. There were 5, now they're going to be 3, pretty much. They have decided they will move on the basis of the idea that the ANC has sold out. It's sold out to the descendants of settlers, and that they moved along that line, and that is it. Secondly, that ANC is corrupt and that it's not renewing. And that is why the first matter that have been put on the parliament agenda is the Pala committee idea, which was killed by the ANC in the last parliament because it had the numbers. Now it does not have the numbers. we'll have to wait and see if the ANC will be able to get other parties to agree with it that President Ramaphosa must not be investigated at all, or must be investigated and then an outcome come after that. We have done the action essay that has decided that it's not in the Progressive Caucus because it's a liberal party, so it's on the center right, and that it will be just doing constructive, which means constructive opposition, which means it will agree with the governing party on certain issues and disagree on certain issues. So in conclusion, coalition politics is now our future in South Africa, and then we're learning very fast, and it looks like it will work, and it looks like that the lessons have been learned from the crisis that coalition politics triggered at local government level. So South Africa had a fortune of having experiences with coalition going back to the late 2010s, to the early, when was the 2006, somewhere there. So it has over 15 years of experience with coalition government. There has been a period of experiments, and they've intensified in the past 8 years or so. So lessons have been learned, we hope. On that basis, scientific politics, the politics of evidence-based arguments and technicalities is rising. Parties know they have to know number crunching all the time. The urge to find convergences and coalesce around certain policy ideas, around ideology, has now deepened, but the divergences have also deepened. In this context, how we prepare citizens to continue to deepen this route that is going on would be important. But it's very clear that citizens are never going to elect any ruling party anymore. There's going to be coalition politics going forward. So 2026 will give us a sense of where things are. Asante sana. Thank you, and apologies for being very long.
Thank you very much, Prof. Zondi. And as usual, wonderful explanation, wonderful insights on the architecture, the ecosystem of where we are right now with our body politic and our electoral landscape. And I think you've raised a number of points, and we're already seeing Q&A starting. So we'll come to that as soon as we've had the other two interventions. So I don't want to waste any more time. I want to go now to Dr. Rabele. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, and offer you to make your first intervention, Dr. Rabele.
She's muted.
Can you unmute, Doctor?
Host, unmute me.
You are unmuted.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, moderator, Prof. Zondi, for this very interesting presentation. The Director of Ceremonies, the Sadc PF Secretary General, and the DGHR Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen, may I just follow the protocol and greet you all this midday. As an intervener, my contributions would be purely from a practitioner's point of view, and having been directly involved in these elections, pre and during and post. So just picking up firstly from the points that Prof. Zondi made, there were three legislative reforms that were very, very interesting. Firstly, the introduction of independent candidates, whether that was effective or not, whether the timing for their introduction was really helping the electoral playing field or not. I think that is something we can just look into as we engage. Then the 3 ballot papers, you would recall that during this election, we had a national, provincial, and a regional, kind of like local regional ballot paper. Then there was the introduction of the Braille ballot paper, the universal ballot template, which was expected to assist visually impaired voters. But again, as Prof has indicated, the training of the polling staff seemed to be very limited, as some of them were not aware that there was a UBT, as we called it. They were not able to even assist visually impaired persons when they went in to vote. I'm aware of this because I was directly supporting ASA and Blind SA, which is an organization that supports visually impaired persons. And so we assisted them in deploying observers just to ensure that there's that inclusion. But there was a challenge of capacity from the IEC in terms of training the polling officials. One other point I want to make also to reiterate is that the elections were really influenced by service delivery issues. South Africans expressed a lot of anger and dissatisfaction towards the ruling government, the ANC, as we are aware that during the early voting days, the first 2 days, there was violence in some of the provinces, particularly the Eastern Cape in Umtata and some parts of Gauteng. Those protests had nothing to do with elections. They were related mainly with service delivery, which also contributed to the decline of the ANC votes in these elections, because people were really expressing their anger, their dissatisfaction in terms of services, unemployment, corruption, which were really rampant during this last 10 years of the ANC rule. But also to say, as a practitioner and those of us who have been following elections, not only in South Africa, it's not surprising that the ANC did not get the highest votes. The history of the liberation movements indicates that where the election management body is really fair, is not biased towards a ruling party, 30 years or so, the liberation movement tent political party will start to die, what we call a slow natural death. And what happened to the ANC is exactly that. Prof mentioned, we know from the ANC, there was the measures of COPE, and then EFF, and then MK, plus other small parties that would take bits and pieces of votes from the ANC here and there. So this was expected, that the ANC was not going to be that very popular, given the service delivery issues I mentioned, but the impact of MK on the ANC is something that was really a hit, and that made elections very interesting. What I need to highlight on that is that we must commend the IEC for ensuring that it's not being abused or being biased towards the ANC. We have seen in many countries where the ruling party will do everything it can not to accept the election outcome. So that is one area where we must really say, despite the challenges that we have seen with the voter verification machines, the limited budget, poor training of polling staff, limited voter education, the points that I agree with, as Prof mentioned, the IEC tried to maintain its credibility by not compromising the process in allocating ANC the votes that were not due to the ANC. And we know from many countries in the region that if this was in another country, it would be chaotic. And that is why we have a relatively calm post-election environment. Again, I would want to mention the election court. There were many cases, particularly between IEC, MK, and the ANC that the Electoral Court had to deal with. That also goes to show the independence of the judiciary. And these are some of the issues that Mayor Sokhoma, we need to appreciate and say, what lessons can other election management bodies and the judiciaries in other countries learn around their conduct on elections? But just to also say some of the key issues that I observed, my apologies, I have a bit of a flu. The political parties that were mentioned by Prof, I'm glad Prof mentioned all the key political parties. There's no mention of women-led political parties. And of course, this is where I come in strongly. In the 30 years, we hardly see increasing numbers of active and powerful women-led political parties. We have now good party led by Auntie Patricia de Lille. I think it's the only party in parliament now. There's some issues that we really need to address, not only in South Africa and in the region around participation of women in parliament or in elections. Firstly, looking at the challenges that women-led political parties are experiencing and what is it that can be done particularly. Secondly, all the political parties, the key political parties that Prof mentioned, none of the parties has a woman leader or a woman running mate. So we are sitting in a situation where 30 years later, we're likely not going to have a woman deputy president. It is worrying given the regional protocols, continental and global protocols and instruments around gender equality. The women are there, they are capable, but what are some of the issues that really are a challenge for women in politics? Because when you look at the voter register for this year, there were 27,782,000 people registered. Out of that, there were more women, females at 15.3 million. But does that translate into votes for women-led political parties? No. What are some of the issues? And some of these issues are stereotypes that would take a long time to address, attitudes towards women in politics, but the political party structures internally. What are the policy recommendations that we can make? Perhaps it is time, as I make my interventions, I'll also be giving some of the policy interventions or issues that could be recommendations for legislative reforms. Perhaps it is time that the IEC and the legislature make it mandatory for all political parties to adopt a zebra model of the PR system. Yes, the PR system is inclusive, but what we are seeing on the list, the party list, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, up to number 10 on the list as men, and maybe 20th candidate would be a woman. So that means if the party has only 4 seats, no women involved or women included. So I think one key recommendation from this election is that the IEC and the legislature should have an electoral law that supports the, in fact, that the zebra model should be binding to all political parties, such that when a political party submits the list, it can only pass if it is an inclusive and really has a zebra model, which would ensure inclusive and equal representation of women. We are also seeing a decline in the number of women MPs this year, although I don't have the statistics now because of the delays with the MK signing in, being sworn in. So one has been struggling to keep track of the numbers as the MPs were sworn in. But what we are getting is that all political parties, they have fewer women than they did before. What does that mean for us as a country and as a region towards inclusion? The question of independent candidates, I think although we thought it was really an open space and inclusive process, I don't think they even featured much. The elections were highly contested. The resources available could have been a hindrance for their participation, but there were so many political parties sharing the space. We also noted that the IEC, some of the challenges included limitation in terms of data on people with disabilities, particularly visually impaired persons. When you look at the information on the IEC website, the data on voter registration, it just says females and males. Now, it would have been important if the data was classified in terms of the disability and the type of disability, the gender, and then the location, so that at least the IEC would be more prepared to say, in KZN, there are so many registered visually impaired voters, so that there could be sufficient universal ballot templates. And that is a huge part of the population that has been excluded and marginalized in this election. And we're also thinking that it could help if political parties also have a quota, internal quota for inclusion of MPs, potential MPs who are disabled. And that I think would go a long way if that comes up as a recommendation. I think we must also applaud the security sector, despite the minor challenges here and there of intimidation, hate speech, defacing of campaign posters. Our security sector, the police across the country, they managed to bring the situation and the security under control. And I think that's something we really have to acknowledge. They also didn't get involved in influencing the vote outcomes to a point where we know in other countries the security sector would get involved and all of a sudden election results would favor the ANC. And I think we really need to give credit where it's due and lessons for other countries to say, what is it that the security cluster has done well for South Africa? What lessons for countries that are going to hold elections in the coming year, in the coming months now in the region? I spoke to the IEC, I spoke about the women. Okay, the other point that one thought of during these elections around coalitions and government of national unity, whether this government of national unity will really work, it's something that is giving one, it's worrisome, because the longer it takes for all parties involved to form government, it's worrisome that there'll be stability, that it will really last. But the key question again is, was it really necessary to have this GNU, or this is a coalition tent GNU, which when you look at the GNU in 1994 and the GNU now, one would argue that there's no need for a GNU because there's no crisis. The ANC just thought it would, get parties together and still maintain the majority or the lead. But it seems to be very complicated to form a government, and this is just a not legally binding agreement. Whether they will survive for 5 years, that's a challenge that would maybe require that the legal experts support some legal reforms in terms of how do we make provisions for protecting coalition governments or GNU at national level. As it seems, we're going to go ahead in that regard. For the region, it seems more and more likely that we are moving towards coalition governments and a mixed member proportion. So firstly, maybe it would be helpful if South Africa could consider adopting a mixed member proportion, because it also includes an aspect of constituency rather than relying on political or party lists, which have a good side to it, because PR allows for inclusive parliament. If this was a first past the post system like in Botswana, many of the political parties would not be in parliament, and that could result in post-election violence. But whatever size that this cake is, many of the political parties are included, and that ensures that there's inclusion, but also that people find it easier to work together. So a move towards the mixed member proportion, I think, would help strengthen the governance, not only in South Africa, but also for countries such as Botswana that continue to use the first past the post electoral system. I would really encourage that we need to have conversations around abandoning the first past the post electoral system, where the winner takes it all, because it really doesn't create an inclusive government across the country. And most importantly, in my area of work, where you have the winner takes it all electoral system, there's hardly any women in parliament or in the legislature, given some of the challenges. And just to say, I'm currently reading a book. It's called Madam Speaker Said, by the first woman speaker of Botswana, Dr. Margaret Nasha, who explains all the challenges. This was in 2014. She speaks about the challenges of women in politics, and the issues she raises are still alive now. The experiences are still the same. So I think we need to be really intentional on how we address some of these challenges. Lastly, Prof mentioned funding for the IEC. Yes, we also realized that the funding was tight, hence why civic voter education was limited. So it would be helpful that in the coming elections, IEC gets sufficient budget and works with civil society organizations across the different communities to have civil society helping in conducting voter education, which should not be a once-off event. Voter education should be a continuous event, and it should be continuous. And I hope these interventions would also help the Sadc Parliamentary Forum in engaging with other countries in terms of how do they then prepare for the elections. For instance, issues of people with disabilities, particularly the visually impaired, the data that they collect. And lastly, again, the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, how can you then support the women's caucuses in Parliament? Because women in Parliament across the region, they seem to be working towards their political party agendas rather than a women's agenda in Parliament. So I think these are some of the issues that at this point I may want to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rebele. And I think you've raised some fundamental points, particularly on the issues of women, the marginalized communities that we have to think about in their inclusion within both the candidate list, but also in terms of how do we make sure that they are given more space within this. And I think your point about the mixed proportional system and the debates around that is very important in terms of how do you create that balance in terms of South Africa's proportional representation system wasn't really a winner take all, but it kind of moved in that direction with the way the ANC had dominated within the electoral landscape. And are we there now at this moment where the PR system is really about a sharing, a governing arrangement, a sharing of governance arrangements and governing, and how do you take that forward? But I think Prof. Zondi has been very kind as he's been giving us also time to say that the questions have been answered. So thank you very much, Prof. Zondi, for that. Let me now turn to Advocate Mantula and allow him to provide his interventions. And thereafter, we'll have another intervention from the IEC, the South African Independent Electoral Commission, on principles as well. Advocate?
Thank you very much, Sanusha, and greetings to all the members of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum and my fellow panelists. Sanusha, I will take a different view from the colleagues and just to look at the assignments at hand. That even if when you look at the key trends, lessons, recommendations for this elections, what is important I will come up with is to look at the constitutional and the legal issues, look at our role as the university that we had an observer mission. We have some recommendation also that we want to share. But what is important, I think, to this parliamentary forum is to understand what my first intervener have said in terms of the policy intervention and the legislative recommendations to the parliament. But I think it has to lie with the Sadc model law on elections that South Africa actually has tried to meet the requirements of the Sadc model law. When I was going through this report, and I was also looking at both the Sadc Election Observer Mission report, which is preliminary report. I also look at the Electoral Commission's forum, which is your ECF within the Sadc. It will have been interesting, even if we have, the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, if it was still active, to get their views also about these elections. And I think thirdly, it is also interesting to understand the issue of what my colleagues have been raising now of coalition governments or government of national unity. Others are calling it government of the U10 or government of unilateralism. So my issue is that what Prof. Zondi actually painted was only to give us that political landscape of the elections prior, during, and post. And I think he was also raising the issues that are concerning the EMBs, which is your electoral management bodies, in terms of their funding. He looks at the issues of political party funding, which I think is what the Sadc Parliamentary Forum must also look at, because many member states have to have a political party funding legislations. Equally, I will submit also that for the national provincial coalitions also, we might also need a legislative approach. We might also need to have a legislation, as Prof. Zondi raised, the important national dialogue that was held in this country last year. And that's where I will say that it is important maybe in the Sadc region that when you have this, a stalemate, or where you have a challenge of where you don't have executive now, or you are not able to elect the Speaker of Parliament or the head of state, maybe it is important a year before elections that you have this national dialogue to look at those modalities that he did raise earlier. I am raising so, colleagues, because already in South Africa, we have a local government coalition bill that is before Parliament. So it will be important at the Sadc level to look at that also. But equally so, one will look at the question that beyond that national dialogue is to understand constitutional imperatives. The latest GNU that is being mooted or being raised does not have a legislative or a constitutional clause that allows the president also to, when he appoints the cabinet, to look at the GNU statement of intent, which is not binding now. And secondly, what I've picked up, it is that what my colleague raised also on the mixed member system, on the electoral system, the Sadc model law, it is very clear also about what member states must do. And I will assume that we need to look at the case studies of Lesotho, look at the case study of Kenya, and I will be very skeptical about Zimbabwe or Madagascar to say that GNU, was it a proper GNU? And the other aspect that I felt that it is very important as we are looking at this now, it's in the model in terms of the acceptance of the results. As Prof. Zondi was talking about electoral disputes or electoral court cases, I think one of the important issues was not only the electoral court that was active since January until now. Our constitutional court was also brought in to can decide on the issue of eligibility of one of the candidates who's a former president. Very important that Section 47 became clear when it was interpreted around the person who have served sentence, or who have been sentenced, or who is serving sentence. The other important issue is the diaspora vote. If you look at the best practice, that South Africa maintains the diaspora vote in a very, one can say, managerial way. It is able to can conduct its diaspora vote without any hiccups. And that is a best practice that we could look at. The issue that also we are allowing also what we call the independent candidates for the first time. I might agree with the colleague that maybe the timing, but remember that it was a 2016 judgment that came out that also was a test for us to have what we call the independent candidates contesting at the national and provincial level. We know the trend, they've been contesting at the local government level, but for them to contest at the national level was also a test for our electoral system. The issue that Prof. Zondi raised on the media, I think we have also followed the Sadc model law on elections, the access and equal coverage of the media. I think the only hiccup that we got was the issue around interpretation of when do you play an interview of a controversial candidate prior to the elections in one of the private TV stations that I think members are aware of ENCA, and also of the SABC in terms of coverage. Those are the issues that we have to be very careful on. How do we deal with the media regulation? The aspect of the code of conduct, I think also South Africa has managed, and we have mastered the issue that prior to the elections, there is a signing of the code of conduct by all political parties. And that's how it is very important that South Africa is managing that because it is having what I call the electoral dispute resolution mechanism, that of the code of conduct, that of the multi-party liaison committees that are able to be an early warning system to any dispute that might arise. I'm not sure how effective was that political liaison committee was, because they were the ones also on the eve of the announcement of the elections. They were raising issues also about the electoral tallying, collation of election results. So it is important to also understand the role of the multi-party liaison committees. The role of the electoral court, like I've said, it's very important that South Africa has managed. South Africa doesn't have election tribunal, rather it's got an effective and active electoral court. And that is one of the best key lessons that we can learn. I think one other aspect that one will want to raise, it is also when we look at the observer missions that gave South Africa the thumbs up, whether the AU, Sadc, the EU, but I think the main issue was also around the civic and voter education. That even if you are making electoral amendments, what we were going through is that our electoral amendment matters came on the eve of elections, actually on the month of elections. So it was very dangerous, if one can use that word. Suicidal also. But these latest amendments also, it created confusion amongst the electorates. You look at Section 24A, even if IEC tried by all means to say, but you have a month window period to apply for that Section 28, that if I'm not in this province, I can be allowed to vote in this other province, in the other province. So Section 24A also, it created a misunderstanding. The same applies to the 3 ballots. They also gave a sense of uncertainty even to the observers. As one of the people who were briefing observers from the EU Sadc, that question came up many times, and it created even a sense of misunderstanding of this 3rd ballot and its allocation also. And I think, Sanusha, you were able to give that clarity around the regional ballot. And if you look, colleagues, even last week, the IEC have to go to the dashboard and try to explain how do you add the regional ballot, provincial ballot, and the national ballot. And I think that's the issue that we have to deal with the EMBs in terms of communicating even the issues around allocation of seats. The DROOP system that South Africa has been using, the DROOP quota system, I think it is important for the Sadc Parliamentary Forum to start to develop our own quota system, our electoral quota system. I think, yes, we might want to apply the DROOP system of the US, of the French, but I think it's high time that we need to look at our electoral quota system. How do we deal with it when we are in this current crisis? And finally, Sanush, I think from my point, looking at the best practices, it is the issue that also of how you look at the issue of us dealing with the social media, the issue of how we reacted to the false misleading information. And I think that came out from many observer missions, that the best practice that many member states of SADC or the AU can learn from South Africa is how were we able to respond to fake news, how we were open to engage with political parties, special voting, how we were able to carry it out, despite that there were challenges during the special voting. The best practice also how we managed to work with our Ministry of International Relations when we were conducting the voter education. And I think those are the good best practices that we can look into. I think one of the challenges we had is around security. And it is important that when you look at the securing the ballot and then providing security to the voters, to the candidates, it's very important that we need to understand that security also is also the role of the law enforcement, that they need to be impartial and they need to be present at all times. The role of observer missions, I think we have also mastered that one by inviting many observer missions, including domestic, what you call citizen, and international observers. So our best practice is that we have never managed to observe our own elections, but we have always invited the international observers to come and be the what we'll say, an assessor, a reviewer on looking at our election process. So if one looks at that, I think we have managed in that level. The issue that finally, Sanush, that I will say, it is the one that I'm saying of the hung parliament that colleagues were saying earlier, that I don't think we are sitting with the hung parliament now. We are sitting with the hung executive now, that it is just a matter of understanding that constitutionally in South Africa, 1993, we had an Article 88 that allowed for the government of national unity and allocation of cabinet posts. But then final constitution of 1996 doesn't have that clause that allows that. Even if we have to do constitutional amendment, that should be done in the 7th administration, not in the incoming 7th administration, which is also caught up on this issue around the coalition cabinet. So I think it is important for the Sadc parliamentary forums to be at ease, but I know that for them, it is important that as members of parliament, they will want to have an accounting officer who also becomes the DG, also become the minister. So the members of parliament might be feeling that they are not engaged, they are not active for a month or two now, if you might have a delay. But I don't think in South Africa we'll have this delay like other European countries that have been used by some of the analysts or some of the social media links that have been going on. I think Africa and South Africa have a unique experience of how to deal with the core governing aspects. And I think the issue of the model of law and elections, it is important that beyond this webinar, we need to engage the member states on understanding how to comply, how to align, how to domesticate, so that we don't find ourselves raising the same issues like of civic voter education, access to media, allegations of bias by electoral management bodies, like your commissioners. We need to find out also our electoral dispute resolution mechanism, that it is effective, it is able to bite where it is necessary. The code of conduct, political parties are able to can comply with the code of conduct and don't go outside it and cause what we called a hate speech, or because we had also the cybercrime law that was also in a place, meaning we had all the legislation towards these elections. I think on that note, Sanush, I will pause there because I know I wanted to give the UNISA observation quickly, just to say that one thing that we have experienced that Dr. Zondi, Prof. Zondi raised, it is of the vote, I mean, the officials of IEC that we might need to can increase their number so that we can reduce the waiting time, because there was a question around the waiting time. There was the issue even around party agents also interfering with this process. That's what the UNISA Observer Mission has picked up. The issue of voter education we have picked up. And we are maybe pushing the issue being an online university. Maybe you might need to have online voting in the Sadc region, which I don't think it will work, looking at the challenges of the energy sector, that you cannot go electronic voting. But those are the issues that we have raised as the UNISA Election Observer Mission in terms of recommendations. But generally, as I was giving the key lessons and the best practices and recommendations, I will still insist on what both my two colleagues have said, that it is important for the parliamentarian, for the Sadc Parliamentary Forum to galvanize and push this Sadc model law on elections to also be domesticated in our electoral amendment matters or our electoral laws, so that even electorates and voters can understand how the laws of the elections are being implemented and are being applied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Advocate Mantula. I think you've really put a key point out here around the interpretation of the statutes that govern our electoral frameworks within South Africa, and of course how that is applied in the context of all of the preparations, the implementation, and of course the architecture around the running of the election by the IEC, but also the kind of public knowledge and the kind of public education and civic participation that we need. I really like the point you made about the synergy between the frameworks and the interpretation of the Constitution in the different sections. I mean, that was really one of those key points that we have to think about in terms of how do we actually how the IEC vets candidates on the lists, because I think that was one of the key issues that took us right to the tipping point of our election in terms of where we were in the context of candidates who could actually be on the candidate list to be in parliament, or they had to be basically there was a court case, and you mentioned that very well in terms of the electoral court, but it's also the kind of interpretation between the various streams of the judiciary, which is important. Let me now hand over to Dr. Shale, who is from the IEC, and they're going to talk about the principles and guidelines for the use of digital media and social media, because I think in our election as well, there was a lot of information that was circulating within the social media platforms that needed to be authenticated and also needed to be verified based on what was fact and what was fiction. So let me hand over to our colleague from the IEC. I'm not sure if he's online.
He is. I'm just trying to see if he's ready to come in now. Dr. Shale? We are requesting you to...
Hello?
Yeah,
No.
sure.
Good day.
Please proceed.
Okay. No, thank you very much, moderator, and allow me, given the time pressures, to align myself with all the salutations since this morning. I would also just like to maybe begin by acknowledging the contributions by the various speakers. And of course, I'm asked to say a few words about the Sadc guidelines, but as an academic, I also can't resist the temptation to make one or two comments on some of the observations that my colleagues make. And I'll start this way, Chen, that I think one of the missing aspects of the analysis on what we have just seen is the recognition or admission or whatever you want to call it, I think, of the deficiency in such analysis that seems to be based on South Africa's exceptionalism. I was waiting to see if Professor Sondi would make this from his vantage point of the institute at UJ. I think Sipho touches on this without saying so, but I think we have a lot of lessons to learn as a country from the region, from the continent, and indeed globally. And I think that point has to be made emphatically. And I think this is a missing aspect of most of the analysis that I have followed. In other words, what we have witnessed is nothing unique or peculiar to South Africa. It is simply a delayed manifestation of what we would call the erosion of democratic values, but also an emergence of robust throat-cutting contestation, political contestation, between what Professor Zondi was referring to as the left and the right. So we see that, I mean, and this is not unique to South Africa. You see the unraveling of the populist politics in Europe. They just had European Parliament elections. Gurasha, you would remember we went to Europe in 2020, I think that was 2016 or 2014. We witnessed this already emerging in many European countries. That is the first point. The second point I would like to make is that the analysis from my colleagues today, and indeed to a large extent by many people who are commenting on our just ended elections, lacks the political economy aspect. Because most of what we are seeing here is a result of the political economy. Dr. Rabele says this, challenges have a lot to do with the lack of service delivery. I agree with her, because in that also you can then begin to see the emergence of the elements of the political economy, which I think is missing in most analysis. Now, having said that, Chair, I just want to respond to one or few points that were made for correctness, if not for completeness, because I think we also have the duty to always make sure that we give accurate information, because this is also one of the tragedies of our electoral discourse. For instance, there is a point, and I'll just touch on a number of points without any sequence. Prof. Zondi speaks to what he says is the lack of voter education, and he says the Electoral Commission only had 2 weekends to do this. And I think we need to correct that fact because it cannot be correct. Civic and voter education in South Africa is continuous, and the Electoral Commission, for its part, conducts both on a continuous basis throughout the electoral cycle. The 2 weekends that Prof is talking about are the targeted voter registration weekends, what in other Sadc countries would be called voter registration bliss. It's really just a special targeted campaign to increase the number of voters on the voters roll. That is not necessarily billed as a voter education per se, but of course we do also disseminate a lot of that information. So I think we need to correct that. But I do agree with the sentiment that maybe this still, even as I put it, would still be inadequate. And that also may not necessarily be the omission or commission of the Electoral Commission alone, but I think the entire spectrum of electoral stakeholders, political parties, civil society organizations, as Dr. Rabelo was suggesting, everybody must put their shoulder at the wheel. I think that is important. Another point that seems to permeate almost all media houses and analysis that you listen in South Africa largely of political analysts and election experts has to do with the budget. I think we need to be very careful how we couch that aspect, because an impression is being made that the Electoral Commission went into this election almost deprived of the requisite resources. I think it is correct to say that the Electoral Commission delivered these elections based on the available budget, and that was sufficient to deliver these elections, and it did so. The broader question of the budget's cuts across all government departments and other statutory bodies cannot be denied. But I think we will be maybe putting too much weight on it if it can then be attributed as a factor for whatever challenges were experienced in this. Actually, this idea of a budget was proffered by one friend of Dr. Zondi's in one of the interviews with absolutely no evidence to back it up. And everybody just keeps saying the IEC was not funded. And I think we need to at least put figures and look at whether or not indeed this would have been a factor that significantly impacted the delivery of NPE 2024. The issue of staff, I want to deal with this at two levels. The first one is that indeed, as one of the speakers indicated, there were over 23,000 voting stations. And there were a lot of electoral staff engaged, the expansion staff, as you would call them, across the board. But another important thing is that the Electoral Commission also introduced a second layer of counting officers that have not been there before. So I think in terms of the numbers, again, whatever challenges were encountered on polling day and during the counting processes cannot be attributed to shortage of staff per se. I think we actually went way beyond what we even initially planned in terms of the human resources. But there's also an interesting analysis, I think, coming, I can't remember whether it was Prof. Zondi or it was Dr. Rabele, regarding the staff. I think somebody said most of these were young women. I think it might have been Dr. Rabele. You are right. We had a large number of young women as electoral staff. But I want to link this also to the point that Sipho makes about the role of the multi-party liaison committee, which we now call a political liaison committee since the introduction of independent candidates, that they have a direct role to play in staff recruitment. In fact, the fact that you are now seeing more young people, a lot of those being unemployed young people, was actually a recommendation of the political party liaison, the liaison committee. So there is collaboration throughout the electoral processes. So I don't know how much of that. We are still in the process of debriefing ourselves. So we will definitely maybe establish whether having a lot of these young people was necessarily a challenge, or there were other challenges, or as has already been suggested, maybe it could point to insufficient time for training, or a combination of both, but we will look at that with time. Last point, Chair, the media, and I think I like the approach that Sipho took in his input, because he really touched on the 4 or 5 key question guide areas as per the concept note. So you'll find that if you run through the Sadc model law, which I had the privilege to be one of the drafters, from Article 1 all the way to Article 94, I think to a large extent, a lot of the recommendations arising out of this document have been complied with in the context of the South African elections, including even the EDR portion of that model law, which is Articles 89 to 94. What we see happening in the courts, through the court system, whether it is at the electoral court or at the constitutional court, is something that is provided for within the electoral justice system, within the election dispute resolution systems or mechanism or architecture in the context of South Africa. Now, regarding the principles and guidelines for the use of social media in elections, that then would fall under the article on media in the model law, especially articles 61 to 67. Indeed, one of the maybe what one would say is limitation in terms of the model law is that it does not give a blow-by-blow when it comes to the digital and social media. However, the principles that Mr. Kurasha refers to fill that gap. These principles were developed by the Association of African Electoral Authorities in collaboration with the Electoral Commission of South Africa, and they seek to assist electoral management bodies to harness the benefits of the digital and social media, but also to help them to guard against the harms that go with the digital and social media. And in this process, we work collaboratively and very closely with the digital companies themselves. We have also been working with civil society organizations, especially Media Monitoring Africa, which has been instrumental in bringing the digital companies together in collaboration with the Electoral Commission, so that where there are aspects or posts or statements that are made through these platforms and are harmful to the electoral processes, these can be identified, and with the collaboration of the digital companies, be brought down. So this is an ongoing collaboration, but we have seen that I think we have been privileged if you compare us with other sister EMBs in terms of mitigating the harms arising out of the negative use of digital and social media. Of course, we have had quite a barrage of social media abuse coming our way, a lot of disinformation, but remedial actions have always been timely taken in collaboration with both Meta, Google, and as the case may be. So I think this speaks to the provisions of the Sadc model law regarding the harmful potential that social media has in electoral processes, and indeed that could inhibit the proper functioning or fulfillment of EMBs of their constitutional mandate. Now, the principles, just like the model law on elections, are not a legal binding document. They are a persuasive instrument that has specific sections appealing to intergovernmental entities such as the Sadc PF, Sadc, the organ that appeal to national governments, national parliaments, that appeal to political parties, civil society organizations, and all other electoral actors. So far, we're seeing a positive response. In fact, a number of electoral commissions that are organizing elections in 2024 and indeed in 2025 have already identified priority areas where they would like to utilize the principles and guidelines and see how they could use those to sort of mitigate the impact that social media has in electoral processes. As we all would agree, social media can make or break elections, and many electoral processes on the continent have had a difficult time dealing with the ramifications of the negative use of social media. Chairperson, I don't know if I have said what I'm asked to say, but I hope I have at least, even if tangentially, touched on some of the important aspects that I thought needed to be raised at this point. I am going to refuse any temptation to comment on coalitions at this juncture, but I'm one of those who have written quite widely around coalition politics, using a number of cases, even in the Sadc region, Madagascar, Lesotho, and so forth. And of course, I will be looking forward to engage with some of my colleagues at an appropriate time on this matter. Right now, it seems like everybody's an expert on coalition politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shale. I think you've really raised very important points, and thanks for the clarification regarding the technical issues around the training, the registration, the budget, which I think has been in the media and been the subject of different interpretations of where the IEC was, but also the IEC, having to manage an election that had to conform to the recommendations from the panel, the review panel, and of course the Electoral Amendment Act, and get all of that down into a kind of space that gives them the technical experience and the technical implementation and operationalization of that, which is really important. And I think we have to commend the IEC in all of the structural conditions under which they have operated. I like the 2 points you made about the missing middle in the discussion around South Africa's exceptionalism. Is it that, or we have reached a point where we are kind of entering this manifestation of where we are with our democratic context, and of course the question of the political economy. I've noted time on Director of Ceremonies. I've noted the time that we are running over. So I'm going to open it up now for discussion. There's been a lot of interesting questions that have been posted on the Q&A chat platform, and Prof. Zondi has graciously answered them. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists want to take some time out and reflect and also respond to some of those questions. But let me open it up to the broader audience, as well as to our colleagues as well from the panel, who may want to also give some kind of feedback on some of the other issues that have been raised. The Q&A is open. I don't want to let this time run away from us, because I think it's such an important discussion we're having. I think when you are asking a question or making a comment, just be mindful of time so that we can have enough discussion going forward. And more importantly, also just tell us your designation and which institute you are representing. So let me open up the discussion for the Q&A.
Just to assist Sanusha, when they indicate, we will give them the opportunity to be able to speak, so they can do so by raising hands, and then we'll give them the opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kuresha, because I think you also have to be able to unmute the participants.
Indeed.
I'm not sure if anyone wants to start off from our panel or respond to some of the comments and interventions that have been made. I think for me personally, it was a very interesting. Yes, Dr. Rabele, please go ahead. I think you need to have your mic unmuted, and you should be able to.
I think it's the host.
There you are.
Am I audible?
You're audible.
Oh, yes. Just a quick response to a question by Linde Sihle on the third gender. To say, yes, I am aware of the third gender, or even more, but because I was basing my interventions on information from the IEC, that's why I just picked males and females, or women and men. I'm aware of that, particularly here in South Africa, where our Bill of Rights allow for that and the freedom of expression, unlike in other African countries. And just to say, I'm happy to note that Steve Mapaseka-Litsike will be going to Parliament. So my apologies for not mentioning that upfront. And additionally, just to say, it was Prof. Zondo who mentioned young people, but I'm glad that it came up. So I'll respond if there are any other questions related to my presentation. Thank you, Sanusha.
Thank you very much. Dr. Shelley? Shelley, you have
Yes,
the floor.
thank you, Chair. Just last point I omitted, which was indeed made by Dr. Rabele. I have to mention it because she's been avoiding me, so I found her finally. So I need to harass her here in this dialogue. Now, this has to do with I think, again, this is really just for factual information from the Commission side. She has made a suggestion that maybe there may be issues around information pertaining to people with disabilities. The correct position, Chair, is that, yes, it is true that in the information that we published, we limited the statistics to the gender. But the correct information is that as the Electoral Commission conducts the registration process, we capture all the information, including the disabilities. And this helps us in planning and logistics. So, sometimes observers would say, I was at a voting station X, there was no ramp for wheelchairs. We don't provide ramps for wheelchairs everywhere. We provide those facilities where we have established that we have voters with the relevant disability. So we have all that information of visually impaired, physically impaired persons, people with unstable hands, and hence we have then provided the universal ballot template. So where you may find that you were at a voting station, it wasn't there. It's not because it was insufficient. It's because we would have established in that case that it's not there. So there might be one or two isolated cases where, as Dr. Rabele says, maybe there was indeed the need for such an instrument, but it wasn't there. But as a general practice, we have all that information, and that is what we use also for our logistics planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing that useful information and clarification on how the planning goes through from a logistics perspective. I think sometimes we don't necessarily realize the mammoth task that involves in actually running an election. All of that. But Dr. Rabele, do you want to add anything?
Where is this now?
No,
Sanusha, I'm covered. We'll take this conversation with Ndedesali on the side.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if there's anyone else that wants to raise their hand and ask a question.
There are a few. We are going to allow Mututu Zeli. Mututu Zeli, please accept the offer to speak.
Hello. Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
Ahead. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Greetings, all protocol observe. I think my question is a simple question based to Dr. Rabele. I would like to know what is the reason in South Africa for women not to participate in parliament and also in political parties. You find that there are a lot of males than females. What is the reason that is a pulling and pushing factor that caused that in the context of politics in South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
We have another end. Maybe we can take a few questions.
Okay.
We have Itumeleng. Itumeleng, please accept to speak.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this highly informative presentation. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay, great stuff. So my submission is really with regards to just the Sadc region in general and the observation of elections. Now, Zimbabwe had their elections in 2023, late 2023. So I think while it is important that we observe successes from the outcomes of the South African elections, there's also shortcomings that have been reported repeatedly with regards to the electoral processes in Zimbabwe in particular, where the elections have been found to not have been free and fair due to numerous reasons, right? So my question really is, what is the role of the Sadc Parliament or Sadc as an organization, you know, to fully appreciating the fact that countries must maintain their sovereignty, but where there is clear indications of electoral interference on the part of a governing party, what sort of reforms or what sort of power does the organization Sadc have in order to influence a fairer practice where the rights of the Zimbabwean citizens are honored? Because I think it's very important that Zimbabwe is stabilized for the stabilization of the region in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I suspect that that's to all the panelists. So that'll be a good. And then we have Mr. Nyambani.
Yeah, Honorable Nyambani.
Honorable Nyambani.
Thank you.
I think his connection is bad.
Honorable Nyambani, I think your connection is a bit unstable.
From Zimbabwe, a member of Sadc PF.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, do you hear me?
We do. It was a bit
Do you hear me?
patchy at the moment. We can hear you clearly now. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Maybe what we can do, Sanushi, is we can try and mute him and then re-establish the connection.
Okay.
And then give him the opportunity to speak when his network is stabilized.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So let me just ask the panelists, I think the one that was directed to Dr. Rabele about the gender composition, and then the other one was about how does the Sadc the Sadc protocols play a role in the context of where you see discrepancies with the elections, as noted by Intumaleng, as noted by the colleague. Please go ahead, Dr. Rabele. Just unmute, please. Can we get to unmute Dr. Rabele's microphone?
Can I start then?
Yes, please go ahead. You go ahead.
Let me start while the Tare is working on it. I think the question about the women participation in the election, the results showed that there was a kind of decline, not leadership things, but general women presence and participation in this. And this is directly linked to the attitude, maturity, and internal constitution in political parties. We know now for a while that the biggest contributor to higher numbers in South Africa over the past while had to do with women winning the arguments within the biggest party that contributed the biggest number of MPs generally and therefore its proportion of women in there contributed to a rising proportion for the rest of parliament, and that was the ANC. Now the catastrophic decline in ANC numbers also affects the number of women in parliament. Now, at the same time, we've seen women maintain some critical position. The woman who is a Speaker of Parliament, the woman who is the chairperson of the NCOP, who replacing a man, and the deputies, both deputies are women. So that's a massive increase there. But that increase comes from mainly the ANC. Again, the ANC had made a decision consciously, perhaps because of women agency within the ANC, to make sure that women representation is good. And then if you look at the premiers as well, they have maintained the number of 2 female premiers out of, and it's an increase. The ANC had 2, it was the ANC that had appointed 2 premiers in the previous government when it had 7, when it had 8 provinces that it was in control of. It was 2 out of 8. Now, the number of provinces it controls have decreased, yet it has maintained 2. So as a percentage, that number is an increase. So 2 out of 8 and 2 out of 7 is an increase. But it's an increase out of decision taken consciously to maintain that. And I saw the Women's League say, no, there's no increase, it's not true. It's 2 out of what? And all of that. But you need to get the entirety of the political parties to take this as an important principle, inclusivity, including gender inclusivity on the basis of sexual orientation. And that is a task that needs to be done. And that has a bearing to what Victor and I were talking about in relation to voter education and citizen education. For as long as we have these low numbers of women participation, it would mean that our civic education is not sufficient. Because our civic education should not be teaching people only how to vote and how to cross, but how to build a society that is inclusive, and then how voters can use the power of vote to change society. But as long as we have this problem, it simply means our civic education and voter education is not sufficient. For as long as a majority of voters still vote male-based political parties, it simply means our voter education is also not sufficient, and our civic education is not sufficient. And Victor, I was observer, and I was leading a team of observers that went to 98 voting districts. I know that it's a small percentage, but in research terms, it's important. And then I saw the reports that are now coming from the 2 other observer missions. There is a general perception, general experience that we experienced that there wasn't sufficient training of officials, partly because they themselves said it. They did say it themselves, that they had not gone through 6 months of training, really. They had gone through a number of workshops of training. And some, maybe they are lying, said they had not gone through anything like a dry run, where they run a mock election as a full team and know how to organize themselves. So we did encounter quite a bit of that, but we thought it is part of the process of learning and growth. A learning institution is an important institution. It's part of growing and learning. I noticed that they didn't use teachers this time, they used those so-called public servants this time, perhaps that's the reason. But they actually drew from a lot of unemployed youth, which was positive. But of course, it had a bearing on experience, because some of them could see no experience of running things elsewhere. And it is not a judgment on the IEC, Victor, by the way. It's a judgment on the society. Voter education and civic education is a duty of society. It's also a duty of political parties. It's a duty of government. It's a duty of everybody else. And when you then see elderly people blocking queues, lot of elderly people in a small little voter district that should have voted on a special day and they are voting on a normal day, then you realize, they probably didn't fully get the message that you can vote on the 27th and 28th because you have that. We have our observers, and I think, and I just checked the numbers now, in 21 districts, found that there was no provision for voters with visual impairment. There were no special thing. So the secrecy of their vote was then undermined because somebody had accompanied them for them to cross it. And then in the two that I encountered that directly. There was no provision for voters with disability, especially visually impaired, for them to vote in secret. Perhaps it's isolated, it is fine, but it was picked up in a number of cases, something that we need to do. And it was indicated that those were available on special vote, but on voting day, they were not there. Perhaps the assumption was that all people with disability would have voted on special days. With regards to the to Sadc guidelines, it's a perennial problem. Sadc does not have the power to implement its own decision. It relies on member states out of moral obligation and out of honesty and integrity to implement the decisions and the guidelines that Sadc has, and that is a catch. What happens when member states only give superficial commitment on it or deceive Sadc? What happens when member states are not sufficiently committed to a Sadc idea? The Sadc idea does not quite get to be carried through. So Sadc has to operate on the basis of persuasion and begging and finally appealing to moral obligation and integrity. But that is not always the best way to get things implemented. That is because member states of Sadc have decided to give Sadc limited power. In other words, they've decided to go for what we call intergovernmentalism, where power resides at national capitals rather than in the regional body, instead of supranationalism, where power is given also to the central organs of Sadc to implement what they decide, rather than really coordinate and encourage and monitor as it happens right now. So it is work in progress, and it will grow and it will improve with time. And we see it right through the region, that countries are beginning to follow the Sadc model law and the guidelines, and it is gradually improving how things are run. And my last point is, in the science of democracy, we often say that when the procedures for democracy are predictable and the outcomes of a democratic process are unpredictable, then democracy is mature. Now, getting this situation, even in Zimbabwe, the ruling party lost the election. It just did not allow the loss to happen. When we have situations where we cannot predict the outcomes of an election, then we are maturing. Then those in power cannot be complacent. We've heard it here. The ANC thought it was going to win. It did not win. It does not know whether it will win the next one or it will lose the next one. And that can only be good for democracy because it places citizens above leaders and makes citizens the ones who call the shot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Zondi. I'm noting time, and I'm also noting that we need to move towards conclusions and summary and the way forward. So I'm going to ask Dr. Rabele and Advocate Mantula to be as succinct as possible so that we can move towards conclusions in the next 10 minutes, please.
All right, thanks, Sanusha. Quickly, the challenge, as Prof has mentioned, is the lack of political will and commitment from political parties. It is only the ANC that has made it their constitutional demand or requirement that they include the zebra aspect of the model, which for this election has been compromised. Hence why the policy recommendation from this discussion is that if the IEC and the judiciary could put in, the IEC to advise, of course, the judiciary and the legislature to put in place an aspect of the electoral law that is mandatory to all political parties to ensure that their list, the party list, adopt a zebra model, which would be female, male, female, and so on and so forth on the list. Lastly, the challenge of funding, political party funding, particularly for women-led political parties, it's a big problem. If you look at main political parties that are led by men and parties led by women, there are sources of income for women, for funding for women, that is very much limited. We know of some of these party leaders, famous party leaders, some of them even hide dollars under their sofas or something like that. But women don't have those diverse sources of funding, whether it's legal or not, but it is a fact that men have other forms of mobilizing funding. So I don't know what it is that could be done to ensure that in the legal men or women-led political parties are awarded more funding based on their performance, of course. But thanks for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabele. Advocate Mantula?
Thank you, moderator. I think the aspect of Itumeleng very interesting that Zimbabwe is going to be chairing the Troika, and I don't think Zambia will not want to present that report of the 2023 election. What is interesting on the model, I think we have raised it under judicial, the mechanism under the law is that maybe the members of parliament can be involved through the multi-party liaison committees, which has to be effective, or secondly, through the conflict management panels. That's how members of parliament can be active. But nothing on the model of law on elections raises the role of the Sadc PF. What should it do when there is an electoral dispute, more so in Zimbabwe? And I think that's a lesson for us also in South Africa. Finally, I think on the voter education, what is important, I think one of the issues that came is that voter education must also go on the legislative amendments that happen and the electoral system. Whenever you make electoral amendments or legislative amendments, electorates must be informed. And the training of the polling staff also on handling technology, very important, as well as electoral legal reforms. I think those are my two parting shots, but I think overall, that's where I look at the role of the Sadc PF, despite that I will assume that the Secretary of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum might have to respond to that question, or what then is the role of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum? Thank you.
Thank you very much, all panelists, and the questions from the audience, both on the Q&A function as well as those that are asked. Am I not missing anyone else, Dr. Kuresha, to ask a question? The gentleman.
There was one hand, but I think it has since gone down.
Okay.
I did internalize. Yeah.
I don't want to miss anyone. I think it was Honorable Member Tendai.
The never came through, but his question was really related to a technical aspect in terms of whether exit polls are allowed in the South African context, and also that whether there is any restriction in terms of distance between where the polling area and political party activity. I think it was just an issue of wanting to learn from the South African context.
Yeah, I think on the exit poll, as to my knowledge, we don't really do an exit poll as you see in the US. There is a survey that's carried out by the Human Sciences Research Council for the IEC, where they look at the experience that the voter had with the whole process of going in to cast their vote. So that is something that is presented on the day of after the election, depending when the election results are going to be announced. Normally, it's about 2 days after the election takes place. So that's more or less on voter satisfaction with regard to the operations, the process, the experience with regard to the IEC's management of the election. I stand corrected in it, but that's my interpretation. And I think on the political parties side, there is a code of conduct that they signed. It is also the part of the electoral law, but then something maybe Advocate Mantula can give us some indication on that. I'm not sure if he's still online, but maybe even Victor can give us some indication on how far from the voting station the political parties need to be. I think they have to stop campaigning a couple of, I don't know, there's a time frame where they stop, but definitely not necessarily being able to campaign very close to the voting station. So that's my interpretation. Shall we go forward to conclusions now, Dr. Qureshi?
I think so. Let's proceed.
Yeah, so can you guide us here in terms of whether you want me to just give a kind of broad outline on the conclusions going forward, and then you have whoever's been taking down the rapporteuring of the session to provide the conclusions and way forward?
There are three key activities. The one is the summary. You can allow Dr. Nube to give that summary, and then obviously as moderator, you take the process forward. We also have an evaluation, and then we have the closing remarks by the Secretary General.
Thank you very much. So let me invite Dr. Sorry. I'm getting tongue-tied. Let me invite the person who's doing the summary to come forward and provide the summary for the session. I really think there's so much of rich information here that we would definitely need to let all of this kind of continue to get our attention going forward.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you, Director of Ceremonies. I would like to recognize, of course, the presence of the Sadc PF SG, and in the interest of time, say all protocol observed. I undertake perhaps to provide a written summary so that I don't go through everything that was put on the table. But obviously, the objective of the conversation was to look at policy recommendations as well as advocacy strategies as lessons from the recently concluded South African election. And there are a number of things that stand out. So I'll just go through those that stand out, and then we'll add to them as and when I present the written conclusions. So I think the first important thing is to acknowledge, and this is from all the three speakers, that the elections were largely in compliance with the normative standards that the model law sets. And that is very important because while we may want to look at areas of improvement, the starting point should be to look at those things that have worked well and why they have worked well. So, and I think this is what Dr. Shale was at pains to emphasize when he intervened, to say the most important thing is to look at what has worked and why it has worked. But most importantly, the issue of the pre-election period, the peace that prevailed, the campaigning period, the disturbances that were there, how were they dealt with? And from, again, across all the presentations, it is clear that there were indeed isolated incidents of disturbances, but these were dealt with in a manner that restored the credibility of the system. And that is important because in the jurisdictions that were referred to from some colleagues who made comments, you can clearly tell that there's a sense that the security apparatus are used for purposes of the ruling party. And that was not the case in South Africa. And then the second thing was the issue of the budget. And while it may seem like Prof. Zondi and Dr. Shale were speaking from opposite ends, I think the point they are making is the same, that the budget is important to the IEC's ability to discharge its function. And from what we have from this discussion, it is clear that there were budget cuts. Whether or not they implemented, perhaps that is where studies that have numbers and clear effects of those cuts can come in and say, because of the cuts, this happened. And at this point in time, it's just conjecture that, well, maybe there was no training because there was no money. But those are conversations that still take us back to the importance of the model laws and what they say on funding of electoral management bodies, because they need to be sufficiently funded, to be independently funded, to use their budgets as they see fit and not to be interfered with. Then the third thing was the issue of addressing disputes post the election. And we know this, and Prof. Zondi repeated it, that there are 20 parties that disputed the election outcome. And yet the process through which that was dealt with, again, was sufficient to restore the credibility of the process. Because in other jurisdictions, again, those were mentioned, the issue is always a feeling and a perception that those with the mandate to adjudicate on these disputes, again, are biased. And so two things stand out. The first is the issue of the security forces, and the second is the issue of the courts. Those matters that came before them, how did they handle them? What was the effect of the outcomes on the confidence or lack thereof of the general populace? And then the fourth thing, which didn't so much come out as clearly as one would have wanted, was how to deal with what Prof. Zondi called the Zuma factor and his ability to mobilize the poor. And in that context, the takeaway is the ability of the system to deal with those shocks, if I can call them shocks, because he comes in and has really tested the system through the MK and its activities. And the system has held its own from the courts, the law enforcement, the ordinary man in the street. And that is a takeaway for other jurisdictions in the region and how they could deal with shocks to the system. And of course, there were issues to do with the media that I'm not going to go into detail in. And then there was the importance of the laws to regulate coalitions. So the takeaway from this for the region generally is that while there may be jurisdictions where there is a dominant party, it is still advisable and it wouldn't hurt to start thinking about possibly a law that deals with coalitions in instances where you have no outright majority. I know in other jurisdictions there's a runoff until there's a winner, but in jurisdictions where you have proportional representation and there's no requirement for a 50+1, there is a need to start thinking about how to deal with coalitions. And then, of course, training of the IEC staff or generally electoral management bodies. And again, even when Dr. Shola came in, he also says there was a need, yes, but although that need cannot be attributed to the budget, it still existed. And that is a lesson. What are those things that are pertinent to a free and fair election? Because when you look at the complaints of the Umkhonto weSizwe Party, for instance, they allege that some people were unable to vote because of the inefficiencies of the electoral management body. And that in its own is an issue that speaks to the ability of the electoral management body to carry out its function. Then finally, there was the issue of social media or information management. And I think this is quite huge, and I'm glad it came out to the extent that it did in all the presentations, that electoral management bodies have to make a conscious decision to partner with all stakeholders to manage the dissemination of information and quick and efficient responses to posts that pose a threat to the electoral process. And we see that in other jurisdictions, fake information, populist statements that advocate for violence can easily turn the country into violence. And generally, those director of ceremonies are the issues that stood out. I think the rest I'll include in the written presentation just for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ndume. It's really important that you've set it out in these several areas in terms of the normative framework and the fitting of the election within that, the budget and how that can play a critical role, the question of addressing disputes and how those were adjudicated both by the IEC. We hear that the IEC had around about over 900 disputes in this election and a period of 3 days that they were adjudicating these disputes. And one of the big disputes is the question of the boards going down, the electronic boards going down, and what happened in that period. Was that one of the key issues as well that has been brought forward by this application that has now been made by the MK party that says over 9 million votes are being disputed as to whether they've been kind of not included in the final count. And this is where we are currently. How do we feel about the Zuma factor and where does the Zuma factor fit? I think one of the key things we got to think about in the South African election is the pre and post period, the pre, the during, and the post period of this election. One of the key things that I think we also have to be very mindful of is the ability to deconstruct the legislation that has taken place. So from when the Constitutional Court had mandated the Parliament, the sixth Parliament, to come up with a model or a framework including independent candidates, that panel of review that had to sit and come up, which was led by the former Home Affairs Minister, Dr. Arya Mosoledi, was very critical because it also meant that the timeframes in which the IEC had to operate to get its voter registration out, to basically also make sure that the voters' roll was up to date and actually reflected the amendments to the Electoral Act. Most importantly, I think was critical in terms of what jurisdiction the IEC had and what jurisdiction was coming out from the Constitutional Court ruling to the panel, to the Parliament, to actually find that panel come up with the recommendations. And I think this has been one of those gray areas of uncertainty because, again, the question was the allocation of seats for independent candidates, which was a big issue that went through a number of different iterations and ventilation, and eventually came up to the fact that the civil society groups that took this up as a legal matter, the Constitutional Court ruled that there was no kind of basis to say was what's going to happen in terms of how do you allocate the seats in the National Assembly around the 350 versus the 50 for political parties. That was a big debate as well. The second thing on point number 4 is really the question of what was going on in terms of the parallel issues, the contestation in the political landscape, both in the context of what is going on with the MK party coming out and making the statements that they made in the run-up to this election. And then, of course, there's also the issue around the interpretation of the sections of the Constitution where the IEC had to also then it can't vet every candidate on the list. And so they also get these public comments or these public responses that they don't feel that this candidate should be on the list. And it comes out in that way as well. I think Professor Zondi and other panelists mentioned one of the IEC commissioners that was then taken to task by the MK party. But all this becomes part of the ability of the system to respond to the challenging environment that we had. But also this challenging environment does not necessarily mean we've resolved issues. We're going to continue to come into contact and be confronted by these issues around the interpretation of how do you actually look at candidates that are put up as candidates for the party lists, etc. Who doesn't get on, who gets on, but more importantly, do they fit the constitutional mandate? Because these are members of parliament that take the constitutional oath or they take an affirmation. And that's something to uphold the constitution. That's something that's very interesting right now when you look at the 58 members of the MK party and you look at who's leading the MK party, who is a former judge president that was impeached, who is now leading the MK party. That raises questions about, how are we interpreting supporting the candidacy as well, in terms of the gender question, but also in terms of the number of younger people that are in the parliament. I think the laws to regulate the conditions are important. We don't necessarily have anything in the constitution that regulates how we're going to be in a GNU or a coalition going forward. And that, I think, is where most of the uncertainty now lies for us, in the context of that corridor of uncertainty with regard to what is the legalized or the legal framework that will govern this GNU. How would that be interpreted in Parliament, with policies coming to Parliament around the appropriations bill, the budget, legislation that needs to move forward on the political economy questions around what was discussed. And that's really very important for us to understand, because that could end up in procrastinated debates in Parliament and not getting the kind of traction moving forward on policy decision-making and implementation. Perhaps this is why we kind of find ourselves with a president, but not a cabinet right now, who's going to basically move the legislation forward, but how that accountability in Parliament is going to happen, because now you have a much more contested Parliament in terms of the number of seats that are there. And Professor Zondi broke this down for us in terms of the GNU around the 60% question of the deadlock and the sufficient consensus, but that also means that what happens in the GNU, because in terms of the seats, in terms of paragraph, I think it's 16 and 19 of the statement of intent, it's really the question of what constitutes the sufficient consensus. Is it the electoral outcome that 60% of the seats in Parliament are made up of the ANC and the DA, but what do you do with the other members coming in? There are a number of parties that are there that don't have the kind of big seat numbers. You got a lot of 3-2-1 parties that are also in the GNU and have moved from the Progressive Caucus. I think the other thing to remember that we have to think about as well, apart from just the technical questions around the electoral management boards and the social media, because there has been a lot of misinformation about how the votes were counted, misinformation about the formula that arrived at who gets a seat and how that is allocated in terms of the first allocation, the second allocation, the third allocation. I think there needs to be a lot of that needs to be disaggregated so that people can understand. I think one of the key things that the IEC is confronting with now is that what they've done in terms of the fact that because of the Electoral Amendment Act, they separated the ballot papers into the national, the regional, and the provincial. That confused people, but it also made it quite interesting and intriguing, where when you look at the election dashboard right now, you see that the ANC got 12 million votes, or over 12 million votes. And people are then raising questions on social media is, oh, there is probably irregularities here, because if the ANC has got 12 million votes and the IEC is trying to explain that they've combined the national vote and the regional vote together to get the 12 million, people are now raising questions about whether the IEC has not been able to be more clear about the calculation of how they came to the 12 million. There's a lot of people that are going out on social media and they are raising questions about whether the IEC is now a credited or a discredited organization, because they are confusing a lot of the formula and the calculation and how this has been done. So I think there's a lot of that needs to go forward in terms of education and electoral management bodies, in terms of how you actually understand the complexities of our election that is broken down into these 3 votes that is part of the Electoral Amendment Act. The Political Party Funding Act also is important. Final point, and I can see the director of ceremonies coming on. Final point is, I think we cannot ignore the question around these ideological divisions or this ideological spectrum in our country. But the question for me is not only about the ideological, it's about the realignment of opposition. Because for a long time in South Africa, the question was, do we have a viable opposition? Now with the DA and the ANC in this coalition agreement, or this coalition of a government of national unity, the question is, who is the official opposition? And it raises the question, circling back to the MK party and the Zuma factor and the questions around, are we seeing a realignment of our opposition as well, and how this will play out? Thank you. And I want to now hand over to, I think, the evaluator to do the evaluation. I just wanted to make those few points so that we contextualize where we are and how much of this is about the structural conditions as well in our electoral landscape. Can I now hand over to the person who's going to do it?
Sure. Thanks very much, Sanusha. Ronald, and colleagues, note that the evaluation is critical in terms of both the form and content. Remember, this is the inaugural webinar and would benefit a lot from your inputs. Ronald, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. I've just shared the evaluation form. Kindly fill in all the questions, please, and in the end, click on the submit button for us to tally what you've submitted to. Thank you very much.
How many minutes do you want us to allow you, Ronald?
We can do it for 5 minutes.
Okay. We'll have 5 minutes and then we come to the conclusion with the closing remarks from the Secretary General. We encourage everyone to submit, to make As we approach minute 5, we are on 44% of our participants. We have responded. We want to allow a further minute so that we have as many of the participants who are present giving their opinion. As we said, this is critical because it will help to shape the future engagements under the webinar series. We have hit 50%. We now need 50% plus 1 to have a sufficient majority to make decisions on your behalf. Sanusha, I think we can proceed with the next item while the polls are running.
So thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies. I think, we've come to that point. We're running about half an hour over time, but I think it's been really worth the value. We want to now hand over to the, I think it's the Program of Parliament, Dr.
To the Secretary General. We are moving to the closing, yeah.
Yeah. So we want to basically hand over to the Secretary General to make the closing remarks. I think you had one more person, Dr. Joseph Manzi, to do update on next steps and future engagements.
It's taken care of. The closing remarks from the SG will also give sufficient ground. So to make up for time, we have agreed to.
So thank you so much. Let me invite the Sadc Parliamentary Forum Secretary General, Her Excellency Sekoma, to make the closing remarks and also to thank all of the organizers and the participants and everyone who has been here for the duration of this inaugural webinar.
Thank you very much, Sanusha Naidu. Maybe, I don't know how you give yourselves a round of applause in such a context where we are virtual. I'm sure there's somewhere there where you can actually get the hands clapping. But just to thank you and Mr. Sheldon Okurasha, including the technical working team, for really being so kind to the Sadc Parliamentary Forum. Often when we start these processes, I was looking back and say, when the Sadc model law was developed, there was a wide consultation, a lot of engagement and input, and the same members and more are still with us today. So I want to thank you very much, members of the Technical Working Group. Thank you very much, Sadc citizens. Thank you very much to the youth out there and media and many others who have joined us at this point. I don't know whether I should start with the most simple question. I don't know whether it is going to be simple or not, but I recall, because I've just, Dr. Muntala, is it Muntala? Was putting me on the spot around
Mandula.
Mandula.
Mandula,
okay. He was really pleading that he hopes that I respond to what Sadc can do, or Sadc PF can do. But I'll invite him for tea so we can both innovate around what we can really do around these issues. And just to thank everybody who's presented equally on this particular symposium and say this is just the beginning. And we are hoping that we'll continue to dissect the issues, particularly because this particular question of what is next is still unraveling in South Africa. Now, Dr. I wish I knew the first name. Is it Muntali Kurasha?
Sipho Mandula.
Mandula.
Yes. Sipho
Okay,
Mandula.
Doctor.
I forget Sipho Mandula.
Doctor, if I may say, I don't know, I'm getting tongue-tied with a very simple name. Allow me at this point just to respect, be respectful to the sacrosanct notion of separation of powers and the whole notion around sovereignty, and not get into what you and I can speak of maybe over tea. But safe to say that coming back to the interests of the technical working group and the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, we really want Sadc citizens and anybody else to really put to practice the whole issue of domesticating our model laws. This model law in particular, this one of the elections, it's an instrument that we believe that all of us can see and can be witnesses of, to the fact that it really binds itself to the regional ecosystems around the subject matter. It binds itself to guiding references that we use ordinarily around elections. And therefore, the model law equally is trying to provide guidance to national parliaments, to persons such as yourself, to line ministries, to civil society organizations, even judges, when dealing with issues of international law or domestication on elections. And that is why I was quite pleased when Dr. Shale took us back to the model law. Most of the issues that we're discussing, particularly on issues around gender, he spoke of other issues in the model law. Because of time, I will not stand between you and your freedom. But when we spoke about gender, I was quite intrigued. I was actually very happy when we also cited issues around vulnerable persons. I would like to say that all our model laws, including this one on elections, we have general underlying notions or principles which guide on some of these issues. We are very clear around equality of treatment before the law. We're very clear around securing human rights and non-discrimination and gender equality and democratic accountability, which are subservient notions that serve to protect all citizens and everybody else. And I'm just citing these few. I'd also like to go a little bit deeper to say, for many years, I can't remember, even before I joined the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, the Sadc PF was big on issues of engendering parliaments. And some people kept asking, what is this engendering notion about? What do we really mean? We're basically trying to look at issues of how we can relinquish patriarchy so that it doesn't influence our lenses around where we go to the ballot or at any point where we have to choose who can lead, even at the level of a committee of a Sadc Parliamentary Forum. One of the presenters also referred to the regional women's parliamentary caucuses, that they're left to struggle on their own. But I'd like to come back to say, when you look at the Engendering Parliament project that was started many, many years ago and adopted by many other regional parliaments, we were really trying to say, let's engender equal recognition of those who participate in the democratic processes. Let us ensure that the political spaces are open to both women and men and any other. Let us make sure that we don't begin to look at elections and money and say that women will not qualify in the race. Let us not look at women's economic status and say no, or social standing, and say they have to request for permission from their husband and families before they get into the bandwagon of elections. And it is for this reason that we must not be satisfied with the current levels of gender representation in positions of decision-making or even in parliaments. And this model law goes further to talk about engineering. We moved from engendering, which was programmatic. We went to the model law. When you look at the language that is used in the model law, we're looking at constitution shall engineer processes that will bring us to a point where we are not going to talk about gender as remote, but rather that the gender issue must be an issue of adherence and codification. And it is for this reason that I'd like to thank you for bringing this issue up, because we must really move further into ensuring that we don't now become talk shops around gender equality. We don't just talk about democratic accountability in vain, but we must really be subservient to these notions and take it further. I'm also pleased to note that the cross-cutting issues that you raise are what the model law also encapsulates. You've talked about money and politics, and some have gone further to talk about the stereotyping around money. Some of the literature that you go through around this particular subject matter, some talk about, democratic capitalism, or that there's a crisis around money and allowing people to participate in elections. I think Dr. Shale spoke about the whole issue around resourcing our institutions. And I think this is what Sadc Parliamentary Forum can continue to speak to and encourage parliaments to really look onto this matter during appropriation. And maybe for South Africa, it may be a matter for a committee to look into and say what happened during elections. Did we fall short of our constitutional imperative to ensure that our democratic institutions are well-resourced? And what could we have done better in this regard? And I'm also pleased to note the fact that all of us are underlining the whole issue around accountability and the rule of law, which are really basic tenets for any functioning democracy. I'm not going to get into the details because we've talked about them in detail. And I'm encouraged by what was mentioned around the prevailing jurisprudence in the region, that we must go back, look at this. If possible, some of you can do judicial activism indirectly to complement the Sadc model laws or any other body of knowledge that already exists in this area. I also want to say that we spoke about the gaps that exist in the Sadc model law. The Sadc model law was done in whatever year, and there'll always be gaps because there's an evolution, there's a change every day. We learn from one circumstances to the other. But I think that while the model law can play a strong role in filling the existing gaps in some jurisdiction, it may not do so. There'll be areas where the model law is silent, where we need to seek conformity with constitutional principles that will bring consistency with constitutions in our countries and any other aspirations that we hold. And this is the reason why I'm so ever grateful for the technical working group and partners that you work with by extension, that we must continue to review this model law. We must continue to bring light, even if we have to have annexes that we take further. This is the role of the technical working group. And some of these lessons that we harvest and harness, we must be able to make sure that we create an exercise where there's hope given to those who are ahead or those who are behind, where organizations such as yourself, who wish to consider much more intently international instruments and regional instruments, including this model law, are able to do so to contain significant remedies and recourse that countries can look at. That is the role of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum. We can create that space, we can give you that opportunity, we can avail members of parliament in all the 16 countries for you to interface with them. And I'd like to invite you as I close that in a few days, on the 30th of June, we are going to be celebrating the International Day of Parliamentarism. What an opportunity that this day can give to stakeholders such as yourself who are present here today to go to our site or even post in the various websites of our parliaments to persuade them on this occasion to continue working together with you on democratic accountability. I hope that together we can demonstrate what electoral commissions ought to do. We can look and review at why did we have so many court processes in this instance? Is that what we really want? Or we want to look at an opportunity where our systems are much more robust enough that our institutions unto themselves are able to provide solutions and can be trusted ultimately. I'm not going to go further, but I want to applaud the thought leadership that you're demonstrating through this technical working group. I've also had reference to the media. I've also followed some criticism. Perhaps we owe it to the media to interrogate some of and unpack some of these notions, whether it is government of a coalition, whether it's a government of national, what did you call it, GNU, national unity, or whether indeed this in any way subverts our democracy. It's a question of debate before we go to the papers. But also appreciate that headlines are quite important. Readership has gone down, and therefore all of us are using AI to communicate, and we are not making resources available for value for media to see that sometimes disinformation and misinformation goes a long way in creating instability. And perhaps we also need to look at whether our knowledge, and we owe it to ourselves, to look at whether the knowledge that we have is adequately disseminated in a manner that can bait the people that we need so importantly in this particular process. We didn't talk much about the impact of corruption. Maybe it was not relevant in this instance. However, there was intimation around some registration that was done. And therefore, I wonder whether this is another area that we should look at going forward, and the impact on communities, or the impact that would have on citizens who are really hanging their hopes on elections and the electoral processes. And let me end by saying we applaud South Africa, for there was no violence that was registered to the extent that it interfered with the process. We also want to applaud the Electoral Commission. What we saw for us was very good, and there are a lot of best practices that we can glean from in this regard. Political parties' maturity, I think it's something that we must also applaud, and not judge the maturity against the delays around negotiations. We have heard that sometimes it takes longer. When you look at Germany, they give you a certain period. When you look at other countries, all of us, it also depends on the maturity and the experience that we have around negotiating on some of these processes and responding to the social demands. And I think that ultimately we're looking at agility of our democratic processes. We are looking at the leadership. We don't want an alternative to democracy, despite the struggles that we have. With that, let me thank you and wish you continued cooperation with the Sadc Parliamentary Forum. And I'm looking forward to hearing more around this participatory democracy angle that we've introduced and see where it takes us. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for believing in parliaments, for there's no other option in this regard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I mean, I think you've really summed up a really rich, in-depth discussion, which I think we could have a whole week of discussions around. But thank you so much. We definitely think your invitation is important for all of us to contribute, not just as members of the Sadc Parliament or members of the South African National Parliament, or whether we call it the Government of National Unity or whatever the terms we use. But I think it's all of our civic participation and duty to contribute towards that democratic agility and leadership. And I think there is no alternative but to have that incredible citizen participation and to be able to have that engagement. So I think you've set the tone for the inaugural webinar. You've actually created the platform in terms of us returning and continually sharing our lessons learned and what we are doing in our respective countries as members of the Sadc Parliamentary Forum, not just as members in the parliament itself, but as members of civil society, academia, scholarship, across the board, and even including business, and to what role that we can play in enabling and ensuring that the next generation of democratic leaders, young leaders who are going to take over the mantle and go forward, is going to be the people that we want Africa to be led by. and the region to be led by. And I think that's our duty to do as knowledge persons and engaging in teaching, whether we are in governance, whether we are in government or out of government, in business, in civil society. We need to do that as our civic responsibility. So thank you very much. And I think I will set my hands like this because I can't find the button to say thank you to everybody, but thank you to everyone who stayed the course today. I think the organizers have been really appreciative of the fact that this discussion has taken us into those very uncharted territories that we need to have the awkward discussions on. And I think in South Africa, we are having that and realizing that we are in a very important time in our democracy, and that there's a maturity of our political leaders, and that the system is being tested all the time, and it's a work in progress, just like the Sadc Parliamentary Forum will be, and the model law will be a work in progress all the time. So thank you to the panelists. I think we have to give them a round of applause. They were absolutely fantastic. They've given us more things to think about, and I wish that we have more of our students in the jurisprudence of electoral law, and more of our students from governance, leadership capacity from these institutes to be online, so that they can take the discussion and the iteration of the kind of region we want go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and asante sana. We may terminate.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks to our